ਕਿਸੇ ਵਜ਼ੀਰ ਦੀ ਕਿਸੇ ਰਾਜੇ ਦੀ ਪਰਵਾਹ ਨਹੀਂ ਕਰਨੀ ਭਾਵੇਂ ਕਿੱਡਾ ਵੀ ਵੱਡੇ ਤੋਂ ਵੱਡਾ ਹੋਵੇ ਗੁਰਮਤ ਦਾ ਤਿਆਗ ਕਦੇ ਨਹੀਂ ਕਰੂੰਗਾ ਇਹ ਆਪਣੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਦ੍ਰਿੜਤਾ ਹੋਣੀ ਅਤਿਅੰਤ ਜ਼ਰੂਰੀ ਹੈ
This conversation, we thought we'd talk about Sikh Parchaar and influences. So this Sikh Parchaar is something that we've been talking about for quite some time. And yeah, I think it's important to understand what the Parchaar landscape is, especially in the diaspora, because there's actually not that many organizations that do Sikhi Parchaar in the diaspora, if it comes down to, especially in English, right? Punjabi te ek hor gal hai, like every gurdwara has, their infrastructure, and gurdwara in the UK are always calling over like kathā and pracharaks and taddis from Punjab, and there's jathe that go around, and kirtan programs that happen. But if we're talking about Parchaar in English, that is a really interesting phenomena, right? So how do you guys see the Parchaar landscape today? And I guess there's a few related questions to that as well. How do you personally learn about Sikhi, and what even is Parchaar? If we were to think about what Parchaar is and what it should look like, I guess. So those are the important questions. And then we can, I guess, move on more into English Parchaar and why it exists.
Yeah, I think for me, like before we start looking at the landscape of where Parchaar is at, and even what we mean by that, especially in the diaspora, because I think Parchaar in the diaspora means something different, or it's come to be known as something different to perhaps what Parchaar was in Punjab, and maybe what it is in Punjab still. But like, I think if we start with like, what actually is Parchaar? What does Parchaar mean? And I was looking at like the actual dictionary definition according to Mahan Kosh. And so by Kansanaba in Mahan Kosh, he writes that Parchaar, he says, Kise karaj de chalaun ate phailon di kriya. So he says that basically Parchaar is the act of spreading some work or something, right? So Parchaar is specifically just that. And I think we've, over the generations, given Parchaar maybe a specific like meaning based on what that Parchaar is. But Parchaar in the broad sense is just the spreading of information, right? And so I think that's the first thing, because then we can start looking at what the landscape is like, because within that, obviously kathā is Parchaar. A podcast like this could be seen as Parchaar, writing, books, teaching. There's different forms of Parchaar. So I think the medium of Parchaar has changed based on the audience. And I guess one thing that we want to try and touch upon in this episode is where Parchaar is at, I guess, in the UK, and maybe how that compares to everywhere else. But this like rise of the social media influencer and this, and how that's been given prominence. And then within that, we're seeing how Parchaar has been changed, because Parchaar is no longer like, Parchaar becomes contingent upon marketing, how good your marketing is. So like, it could be sensationalism. It could be, asking these really like, I don't know, sometimes like odd questions that you wouldn't ordinarily see within the traditional setting of Parchaar. So on the one hand, I guess what I'm trying to say is that Parchaar has evolved, and Parchaar I think should evolve, based on, technologies and what sangat need in different areas. But equally, like Parchaar can't evolve or develop so far that it's no longer Parchaar. It's just a marketing activity or exercise. So I think it'd be good to get your guys' thoughts on that. But for me, like if we agree on what the Parchaar is, and then maybe look at, because even like within the Sikh tradition, like I said, like there's been different types of Parchaar that we've had, because the whole purpose of Parchaar is to spread that information, spread Sikhi in essence, right? But I think today where we're at now, with like organizations on the one hand, but mainly like where social media is at, and how in many ways social media has been given prominence with like reels and clips and clickbait, and then you've got this weird space where you have people who have no accountability to sangat, because Parchaar in the traditional sense you would have had a bit more, I guess, in person Parchaar taking place. Now it's like anybody with a camera and a decent setup can chat GPT something or Google it or write a little script out, and they're away, and there's no like accountability, and it becomes quite toxic quickly as well, because people then rightly or wrongly will start to criticize that person, and then they kind of exist in their little in a little isolated environment. So I think Parchaar has like evolved, but if we go back to like what Parchaar was, and the purpose of it, I think that's maybe a good starting point.
I think, Parchaar as the propagation of Sikhi that 100% that makes sense, right? Like the purpose of Prachar is to spread Sikhi. And I guess it gets confusing, especially like the English Prachar landscape and, what happens to Prachar when it encounters English. It deserves a whole, focus and conversation, because it's such a fascinating dynamic, because that's where I think the marketing comes in, right? So if for example, if your goal is to propagate Sikhi, and then you accept that you're going to propagate Sikhi in English, then you accept that you're going to use this tool, and I think something else happens in that space. When we look at Prachar in Punjabi and we think about like our Ityas and all the examples that Guru Sahib has given us and created, all the technologies and the methods that we have, is very clear to me how Prachar functions. And I think Kapoor Singh writes about Prachar, and then he talks about how Prachar comes from the nature of the Sikh, that the way the Sikh behaves and conducts themselves in the world, that is the most effective form of Prachar. Because I think Prachar, and I don't even know how to say the word, but what Christians do, prolesterizing or whatever, like, there all those kind of Sikh scholars, especially, the early 19th century ones, they make this distinction that, Sikhi isn't a prolesterizing religion, that we don't go out there trying to seek conversion.
A missionary, yeah.
Yeah, and then he's writing in that kind of environment, and he says, that Sikhi's Prachar is most effectively done, in your character, in your reni as a Gursikh, right? And Guru Sahib talks about, when, the qualities of being a Sikh, a Sikh pyara nahi, and he said, "Ret pyari mujhko Sikh pyara nahi." So the Gursikh Reni is an important factor to Prachar. It can't be separated. Like, it's not just, we don't have this, public and private sphere separation, like politicians do. In the public sphere, you can talk about, duniya da pala karna, and your private life doesn't matter. In Sikhi, your character matters to the nature of Prachar. And for me, whenever I think of Prachar, and I think of our, modern circumstances, modern in the sense of Sikhs living under the nation state, I immediately think of Sant Jarnail Singh as the epitome of Sikh Prachar, because he propagated Sikhi, but he propagated Sikhi in a way that is responsive to the conditions of the day. He's not, teaching historic Sikhi as, some of Prachar today would do, whether it's in Punjabi or in English. He doesn't separate, Sikh history from what's happening in front of him and, like, the Sikh Sangat. So he's taking the incidents that are happening, he's connecting them to Sikh struggle that's happened over the centuries, and helps Sikhs understand their position in the world. And it's like one of the most effective forms of Prachar that we see. Yeah, and like the Prachar landscape today, I think is really interesting.
The point you make there about the English Prachar, I think that's really interesting, right? Because a lot of this conversation will be driven by that, I think. So, because I think in our minds, perhaps we're thinking about specific examples of, Prachar taking place in English, irrespective of which platform it happens on. And I don't want this conversation to become like, like one of those discussions where retrospectively criticize English Prachar without like acknowledging the root problem of why we do Prachar in English. But because that's something I think we've kind of alluded to, right? Like we've spoken a lot about, like, our displacement, how we've arrived in these countries, what happens in Punjab to the way we live, the way we've governed, we've lived in society, and we've looked at, I think, briefly in the past about how Sikhs differ in Britain to Canada to US to Australia. So even this term like Sikh diaspora, it's not like, I don't think we can generalize it. But the point I was going to say was that, yeah, the Prachar in English is like criticizing that is different, I think, to like in my head anyway, because I think like even the act of translation itself is massively problematic and obviously very limited as well, right?
Definitely, there's always a political aspect to it as well. So when Guru Granth Sahib Ji Maharaj was first translated, why it was translated, by the colonialists, and how they were doing that to obviously try to frame Sikh in a certain different way, and we're now using those translations. So that's massively problematic. I think there's a distinction to be made as well between doing Prachar of Sikh in English and in England, or in Western countries. So I think that plays a massive, like if they were doing Prachar in Punjab in English, it still would be massively different, because there is, I think when I think the Parchaar that happens in the UK, for example, it happens in a different space. It happens in a different context. A lot of it is about awareness, so it's very defensive.
Yeah.
So automatically the kind of things you are doing prachar about change, the nature in the way you describe these things, the selective history that you choose to talk about changes as well. So I think those two things are, because obviously there'll people be watching this and they'll say, Barney has been attempts to translate Barney has happened in different languages. Barney itself has multiple languages and et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's a really important distinction. One is doing prachar in English, and the other issue is like our circumstances here and doing prachar in that vein. We couldn't even do like ਸਾਡੇ ਪ੍ਰਚਾਰ ਤੇ ਇੱਥੇ restriction ਹੈਗੀਆਂ. There's certain things we can't do prachar about openly.
Yeah.
So we got to acknowledge that too.
Yeah, that's what I was saying. You mentioned there like the translation, right, like by colonialists. Even if you go back to like the Singh Sabha period, like a lot of people criticize the Singh Sabha, rightly or wrongly, but the work of the Singh Sabha took place because of an absence of sovereignty. Like there was no real need. You could argue that just that Raj hunda, there's no real need to try and like what's it called, protect our distinct identity, and within that maybe some issues crept in. But it's the same thing. I see the same thing here, like in Parchaar happening in the 21st century, and especially when you've framed it, Baljeet Singh, like the fact that there is this self-censorship. It's not Parchaar fully encompassing Midi Pidi and like the Panthik Siddhant and position. So within that, we're kind of like just rather than making a Sikhi Parchaar, it's become like what's palatable to this particular audience, and within that we're seeing like fragments of it. Like I said earlier, I feel as though there's different prachar taking place of Sikhi based on which colonial settler state you live in, or if you live in a Britain, it's really different as well. So there's that dynamic as well. There's a difference within that. So that's what I'm saying. I don't think we can use like general terms like Sikh diaspora or prachar within the Sikh diaspora, because it is so different between each country. And
each country has different circumstances as well. So I think there's three different topics within this conversation. One is what is prachar at its root, which is what Shamsher was talking about. And then there's the issue of different languages when we try to translate Sikhi. And then there's the issue of it being out here. I think they're three different things.
Yeah, I mean, I see it as like as two real distinct issues. One is like prachar, and I think the focus on English is because English prachar is so problematic. And I think that's what, we've spoken about, privately, over a number of years of the limitations and what creeps into English prachar. Because if we look at like the English prachar landscape, you have some English prachar that tries to emulate Punjabi prachar, where it's like almost like translating, like somebody's watched a kathā of Gyani Pindarpal Singh or Gyani Sher Singh, and they're now trying to relay that information to you in English, and using as best examples as they can. And I see that as being less problematic, because in wherever I've seen that kind of happen, they always end up reverting back to Punjabi and telling you about the kathā that they've listened to and why you should listen to it, and they kind of point you back towards the source of the information. And then you have this relatively new phenomena of like, I don't know how to describe it, like kindly or with kindness, should I say, but it's the self-help Sikhi or the self-help information that is then presented as Sikhi Parchaar, because it's drawing from certain Sikh ideas, and it, the individuals that do this type of Parchaar will, will have some familiarity with Sikhi and will look at like a concept like Manjit Jagjit, and like, how you need to conquer your mind. And then from there, they'll start talking about like the secret and Paulo Coelho and all this, like, 7 habits for like, people, whatever, it goes from that space into like self-help. And then obviously it's quite difficult to differentiate. And then I feel like, that type of Sikhi that's being propagated falls into the category of the opiate of the masses. It's there to help you, cope with the difficulties of capitalism, of like, having to exchange your time, labor for money, and literally you're caught in this like rat race for survival. So in order to, make sense of that, then you lean on religion to help you understand the world. And obviously that's very different from, Sant Janel Singh. If we look at Sant Janel Singh as like the golden standard of Prachar, Sant Janel Singh is about, asking the more profound questions of why power is structured in this way. What happens to the Sikh body living under a system where your sovereignty is no longer your own, where you're now subordinate to a foreign entity, how this goes against your very being as a Sikh. Now you can't exist and, as a Azad Gursikh, ਤੁਸੀਂ ਦੁਨੀਆ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਵਿਚਰ ਨਹੀਂ ਸਕਦੇ, as a complete Khalsa. So Sanji's, Parchaar is about healing that fracture, that separation that happens between, the private sphere and the public sphere, between, the state and religion, all of that violence. Sant Janel Singh is about bringing the Sikh as a whole being into all spaces. So, your Sikhi isn't just cultural content. It's not just there for personal spiritual upliftment. Sikhi then is propagated through the fact that Sikhs are now existing in the world as a Sikh. So when, Gursikhs are in the battlefield, it's no different from the Parchaar that they're doing in Guru Sahib's Hazuri. They're carrying that same world vision with them in all of those spaces. And I think the Parchaar in English definitely doesn't do that, a lot of it. And even the Parchaar that we see in Punjabi, it stays within very safe parameters that why is it that you don't see anything or any Sikh Parcharak that is close to Sant Janel Singh that, and remember, so, Sant Janel Singh's period of Parchaar was, what was it, Baljit Singh? It was like 6 years, right? 6 years.
77 to 84, yeah, it was 7 years, yeah.
7 years Sant Janel Singh does.
Actually, you're right, it's less than 7 years, because August to June, right? So it's less than, yeah, you're right, 6 years. 6 and a bit years.
So Sant Janel Singh is doing Parchaar for like a really short amount of time. And again, it just shows the effectiveness of that type of Parchaar. And from Sant Janel Singh's Parchaar, like I heard a Sikh describe it, right? Like Sant Kartar Singh de Chaunkre de vicho, Sant Janel Singh paida hoye, Sant Janel Singh de Chaunkre de vicho pura sangharsh paida hoya. Like out of the tapasya, Sant Janel Singh's known in the circle as Sant Janel Singh Abhyasi. That's what draws the Naujuan Piri and Sant Janel Singh's contemporaries. That's what draws them to Sant Janel Singh, is his level of kamai, is his level of abhyas, his character, the way he conducted himself. And he brings that legitimacy, he brings that support. And now I think, there's another kind of, space.
I think, before we start comparing that Parchaar to today's Parchaar, let's give more examples. Let's speak more about examples of Parchaar like Sant Janel Singh or others, from Itihas, how Parchaar would be done. Because otherwise, I think if you're not familiar with Sant Janel Singh, if you're not familiar with the gold standard of Parchaar, then maybe that point's not going to hit home.
I think the point is that Parchaar was never like broken off from the wider Panthic objective. Like Parchaar was, like at the beginning, Shamsher Singh mentioned the propagation of Sikhi, right? So, and that propagation was encompassing of everything to do with Sikhi. It wasn't just like one specific aspect. I think the problem today is that it seems to be just perhaps we're nitpicking what works for us. But also, the point we made earlier, Shamsher Singh, about like this kind of self-help Sikhi that's come out. The thing with that is that that's a reflection of our existence in these environments, right? So you mentioned capitalism, living in these societies. It's almost it's an inevitability, because you can start to draw those parallels, because Sikhi is so broad in its scope and in terms of the truth that it brings. You can apply, for example, like neuroscience to it. That's a rage these days, right? Similarly, this is why like some of the early translations, they referred on like Christianity, because that was their framework to rely upon. But the thing is, like the Parchaar today, I think it's lacking because it's broken that connection with like the Panth in terms of the Panth's political. But like Parchaar for me was both political and spiritual. Because if you look at Guru Nanak Dev Ji's like Udasis, like Guru Sahib goes all around the world in all four directions, and like the Parchaar isn't like this Christian missionary kind of style of like conversion, or I'm going to take. Obviously, they bring in the wisdom of Naam and the wisdom and Shabad, but equally, like for example, Babar Bani, like that interaction there shows us that the type of Parchaar Guru Sahib was doing was not a specific type. It was representative of Sikh thought in its wholeness. And then there's other examples, like if you go through Guru period, like Guru Amar Das Ji, for example, when they set up the Manji system. At the Manji system, the by all accounts, there was the purpose of the mandis was twofold. One, it was to go out and do Sikhi Parchaar, and secondly, it was to collect beta, to bring it back to the Guru's Darbar to grow the Panth, right? And similarly, Guru Gobind Singh Ji is like Anandpur Sahib Darbar, like, we know the type of Parchaar that was taking place in there. I think that is the clearest example we can have of like the gold standard of where Parchaar was at, like what was taking place, the literature production, the translation work that was taking place, bringing in, a different, the kind of renowned authors and poets of the time, scholars, to the Darbar. And that Parchaar was not just like, your average, what we know of Sikhi Parchaar today in terms of the religious side. It was definitely more than that. So that's for me, like the comparison. But what I'm saying is that today, acknowledging like, it's fine if you're going to be talking about Sikhi in a specific way. I would even argue it's fine, but you've got to acknowledge the colonial rupture behind that. The reason why we're doing, like, for example, even this conversation, people might be like, well, you guys have a conversation in English. So we need to acknowledge the fact that we're having this conversation in English for a reason. And I think the same way, like from my understanding of Parchaar, is that perhaps when our Parchariks today are not acknowledging that. So if we're taking, like, for example, like Gyani Sant Maski Singh's kathā and translating it and doing the Parchar in English, at the same time, we should be then saying the reason we're doing this is because of the fact that we have been displaced in this massive historical, context there, which I think is lacking. And then what happens is inadvertently, we then legitimize this way of living and this way of being. And this Parchar then becomes like almost this new weird gold standard, right? And everyone's then pushing towards that.
I think the distinction I was trying to make earlier about the difference between it being not just a different language, but our context, our circumstances, is when we've spoken to like activists, educators, whatever word you want to use it, Pracharak, if you want to use Pracharak, from Punjab, and they've spoken in English in England, the message is exactly the same. Obviously, English cannot convey the depth of Punjabi and Gurmukhi, but for example, when Bhai Mandir Singh came to the UK, and he did a few dates around the UK, his message when he spoke in English was exactly the same. So he's not changing what he's saying or his message or whatever, because, and Prabhsharandeep's the same, a lot of these, a lot of the writers and thinkers and chintics and the Panth. The point is that it's not just a different language. It's a different, it's different completely. And I think one of the key reasons for that is, Sikhi is not an individual thing, innit? It's not about me and mine. It's about the Panth. So it's always supposed to be about joining the Panth. So for me, if I think of Parchaar in an image, it's Baba Deep Singh, walking to Darbar Sahib. So there's a number of Sikhs with him, and then there was more Sikhs by the time he gets there. And that's Parchaar, right? That's, for me, that's like he's joining people to the Kafla, he's joining people onto the Marg, right? But what Shahda was talking about earlier, over here, a lot of this kind of self-help thing it's about what you can extract from Sikhi. How it can help you in this life that you're living, disjointed from the Panth, disjointed from your Bolli, your Sikhi, everything, and how can Sikhi try to do malampatti of those kind of symptoms, as opposed to you're there. I was going to say what you can do for Sikhi, but that's like one of those wartime tropes in it. But so that's what I think.
And I think like the English Parchaar as a problematic dynamic, especially that self-help category Parchaar, it doesn't require you, like, Baljeet Singh saying, to contribute anything to the Panth in it, versus like the examples of Parchaar from our Atiyas, from Guru Sahib's time, from all of the Sakhiyan that you think of that are the building blocks for all of Parchaar that happens in Punjabi. Those Sakhiyan reflect the qualities of what it means to be a Sikh and how Sikhi is spread. Whether it's Banda Singh Bahadur, whether it's the Chote Sahibzade, whether it's Bhai Mani Singh, those Sakhiyan form the key components of, Sikhi's qualities and its values, and what happens to your Sikhi when it encounters the world and oppressive dynamics. And I think you can't separate that out from Sikhi Parchaar, because then otherwise it wouldn't be about what it is about. It wouldn't be about challenging power. It wouldn't be about, destroying unjust systems and, sarbat da pala. Then it would be like other dharms where they can exist in a bubble, and it becomes, the goal is spreading that dharm in and of itself. The goal is, like for Christians, is to convert and to make you into a Christian. And if you're not a Christian, we're going to kill you. That's what the colonizers spread when they arrived on land that they saw as undiscovered. When they arrive on Australia, when they arrive on terra nullis, like land that is unoccupied, they were then given sanction by the church to, take over and enslave all of these people because they saw them as being subhuman. So we don't have that type of dynamic within Sikhi. There's no category within Sikhi that allows us to dominate any aspect of Akal Purkh's creation. Ji janta hove, it's all Akal Purkh's Qudrat, whether it's like plants or animals or any aspect. Our relationship isn't one of domination, it's one of existing together, coexistence, right? So I think the English Parchaar space is further exasperated when you look at the online culture that is seeping into Parchaar. And, whether, the online culture calls it Sikhi Parchaar or not, they're messing with that space and they're trying to get involved in that space or criticizing that space. And then I think, another layer of violence is being inflicted. But, just to circle back on the English Parchaar. So English Parchaar is not lossless. When you're translating Sikhi into English, you can't convey a whole world and a whole cosmology of Gurmat, because the medium of the language has changed. English isn't capable of holding Sikhi in that way. And, we've been doing this for, I don't know, like 2 decades almost now. And we're acutely aware of that in everything that we've done, that Sikhi cannot hold you, and it cannot, English cannot hold Sikhi in that way. And it cannot convey those ideas in the way that Sikhi can, because there's no context. I remember when, first met, Prabh Sharandeep, and we went to his place. It was me and Mahoon, and we wanted to learn about Harinder Singh Mehboob and Sehjo Rachio Khalsa in particular. I had heard about it, I'd seen that book in my house. I had, my dad tell me about this book. I had, sections read to me. I knew that this is such an important book. And I've tried to read it as well, but I couldn't comprehend. I could read the words, but I couldn't comprehend what he was talking about. Yeah. So when we went to Prabh Sharandeep Singh and we said, look, teach us about this book, teach us who is Harinder Singh Mehboob, what is this? And then he started breaking it down. He taught it in a way that was actually really brilliant. And he said, you know what? He knew that obviously we're super passionate about the Sangharsh and, we care about Khalistan. And he's like, let me give you the poems that Harinder Singh Mehboob's written about Beyant Singh. And then he read those poems line by line, and he translated those lines. And when he was translating those lines, it wasn't this word means this. It was this line is referring to this universe. That's what he's talking about. Like Jor atha bajda sine cheer maraja udde. Like that line, could read it. I don't know what cheer maraja meant, And then he was like, that is the force that erupted from Beyant Singh's chest is the force of an eagle taking a flight into the heavens. But the flight is the flight of the Prophet Muhammad on his horse into the heavens. That's what Harinder Singh Mehboob referring to. And then there's another poem that he wrote about Indira Gandhi, and he's like Dan Saral, and he was like, this is a type of mythical creature that exists in Punjab's mythology that sits on your chest while you're sleeping and sucks your breath out. How am I going to get that translation without knowing Punjab's mythology, Punjab's culture? Like there's a whole world behind that. Yeah. It cannot simply be translated word for word. It has to be conveyed. It has to be taught. And that's why we have Santhya for a reason. That's why we have kathā, kirtan, taddivar, Gurmat Parchaar. They all go hand in hand. They all go together. They help you look at ideas and concepts from different perspectives so you can build a holistic understanding. And you can do that in English, but it's very, very difficult. And like I'm saying, there is loss that occurs with that process. And also, it's an inherently violent process. Like, you guys are saying that the reason why it's happening is because we've been ripped from Punjab. There's a violent interruption of the state. The fact that we're speaking in English isn't a neutral phenomena. It has to be looked at as a political phenomena that is tied to a history of violence and displacement, that it isn't just a question of language. It's a question that goes much, much deeper than that.
Yeah. And that example is such a good example. And another thing came to mind for me was like translation is never neutral, and it's always a political act, right? There's like academics have written about this, like Dr. Mandir speaks about this in quite a lot of depth. And that also applies to like translation. I think more so it applies to translation of Gurbani. So there've been multiple attempts over the years, right from like Ernest Trump's time. And Ernest Trump is rightly, I think, critiqued for the way he's distorted Gurmat and Gurbani. But also there's a recent translation that came out by Nanak Naam, right? I don't know if you guys have had a chance to read it. And I was watching one of his podcasts, and he said this really bizarre thing. He said that, I firmly believe that if Guru Nanak Dev Ji was around today, then he would have, given us Gurbani in English. And the thing is,
like, is around today. Sri Guru Granth Sahib Ji.
That aside, but I guess what he's trying to say is that if it was happening now and it was the movement was starting now, right? And that's a really weird.
Was here when English was here too.
Yeah, they were. But that aside, the thing with that is, it gives so much power and legitimacy to modernity. And within the interview, like both Satpal Singh and the interviewer, they speak about modernity, but I don't think they fully grasp what modernity is within that specific context, because they're talking about the modern world, these technologies that exist, but modernity is a different thing entirely. So you can maybe elaborate upon it, but it's an entire power structure. It's the way society governs, right? And so the point being, though, that statement is really telling, because even his translation, yes, it may well be better. Most definitely, I think actually is better than the Christianized terminology and language that we use. But equally, that translation that he now brings upon Gurbani, and he speaks about it, and and this is like props to him. He acknowledges it, that it's his own kind of thing, but that carries his own bias and his own experiences, and he also is using a specific framing, right? And some people could argue, well, it's this new age spirituality, because he uses certain words which are, again, palatable to a particular audience. So my position is that Gurbani can't ever be translated, and we shouldn't even be trying to translate it. What we should be doing is going towards the indigenous ways of interacting with Gurbani, and we have a plethora of like examples from our Itihas of being in that environment where you're listening to kathā, you're hearing the divas, you're engaging in santya, you're listening to the prasangs, you're going through it. That's why these things take time, and that's why sometimes you've got to stay in the dals and learn this vidya, right? There's an entire like world within that, but we've kind of like flipped it to the point where, because and the thing is, we flipped it without even, like I said earlier, acknowledging like why we're doing what we're doing. Like all these organizations that exist, and we have like cordial relations with all of them. When they started, the thing was, oh, we need Prachar in English because the youth here are not understand the Granthi Singh sitting, on stage, right? Which is it's a legitimate kind of position to be in, but we haven't addressed the underlying issue within that. And then within that, we've imposed this whole new way of interacting with Sikhi. And that's where I think it's really problematic.
And the thing is, this is why this format is really good, because we get to try to describe or explain some of these concepts in greater detail. Because otherwise, some of these concepts, when you guys talk about modernity, and without obviously being able to explain it on like a tweet or a message or a post, what have you, then people can take away a different meaning. Like, oh, these guys are just reluctant, or they're just hesitant to change. They don't want to see quote unquote progress or like development. But that's not what any of this obviously means, isn't it? That is so annoying, in terms of the whole English thing, and that's so offensive. It's so offensive, because to say, because you know what, it's completely sidebar, but I was having this conversation with this Punjabi guy the other day, and he was talking really anti-Islam. And I said to him, well, if Islam was so bad, I said, why did the gurus never say anything? Or why did they not, order the Sikh to uproot Islam or accept something like that, right? And he goes, "Unhone changi tarah padhya nahi hona." So I was like, chal itthe aisi gal muka diye, because I'm going to get annoyed now. Because I said, chalo, that's fine. Let's just leave it at that now. And it's kind of along that same framework, that to say that Guru Nanak Dev Ji was somewhat, ਸ਼ਬਦ ਕਹਿਣ ਨੂੰ ਵੀ ਜਿੱਦਾਂ ਬੰਦਾ ਸ਼ਰਮਿੰਦਾ ਹੁੰਦਾ, to say that they were not as well equipped, or they
limited.
were somehow limited. This is someone ਜਿਨ੍ਹਾਂ ਨੇ ਧੁਰ ਦੀ ਬਾਣੀ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਲਿਆ ਕੇ ਦਿੱਤੀ ਹੈ, and you're saying, but if they had English,
and like you said, English was spoken in the world.
Exactly.
European,
a lot of the world at the time as well.
Guru Sahib, like Guru Arjan Paatshah, specifically chose to compile Ard Granth in the Gurmukhi Lipi, and within that, even within that, like that in itself, people say, oh, Guru Granth Sahib Ji, contains all these languages. It does, but Gurmukhi is the method chosen by the Guru to present that gyan. Who are we to say, no, hang on a second, we need to because I think, just going back to that point I was trying to make earlier, I think translation as a means to maybe perhaps assist one towards understanding Sikhi or connecting with the Panth and the Sangat, that's understandable. But when it becomes like this statement where if the Guru were alive saying English, that is really problematic, man.
I mean, Guru Gobind Singh Maharaj talks about the Frangis, right?
Yeah.
So they were well aware of.
Yeah.
They were aware of the Europeans. If they thought that there was any benefit to them or any benefit to their mat or anything, they would have told us. They would have, ventured. But like I said, that's just super offensive.
Yeah.
And I'll even say this publicly as well, that one of the things I think he says on the interview, I've got to watch the whole interview, is that about the whole dream thing.
Right.
That my parents said that they dream in Punjabi, right?
Oh, yeah, I got that.
And one thing I find, I find it a bit interesting is that we've publicly spoken about this conversation, Shamsher, you had with Punjab Pujere Sade Vidwania, who said the same thing to us, but the other way around. That your problem is that you dream in Punjabi. You think, you think in English, you dream in English too, and that's actually a problem. So the fact that he said that the other way around, I was like, that's a bit interesting. It was a bit of a coincidence, but
it was also very dismissive. I'm sure. I mean, it would be great to chat to Satpal Singh at some point about this. But
it's a good chat. It's a good chat.
He did say that for him it can't be reversed. Like I think he said something along the lines of I speak in English, and that's it for me, kind of thing. But in neuroscience would tell you that the brain has amazing abilities, and neuroplasticity is a thing. You can definitely reverse all of that. It's just about that uddam, right? And I think this is perhaps more reflective of the wider scene of Prachar. There is this urgency that we've got to tell the world about the Sikhs, and I think a lot of it comes from a genuinely, I think personally, a really good space, like a really good intention.
Yeah.
But the intention is irrelevant if there's distortion taking place, especially under the name of modernity, but not even acknowledging that.
The funniest thing about all of this, right, is that it assumes that English is the same as Gurmukhi, which is a completely flawed assumption. They're not the same, and they can never be the same, and Gurmukhi has a depth to it and a world to it, the same way like English has a world and cultural context. And we've spoken about this before, about how culturally we're more similar to our contemporaries that have grown up in England, because that are white, that are from different backgrounds, because we share culture with them, cultural references with them. We watched the same shows growing up, so we learned about the world through the same metaphors and propaganda that they learned about the world, right? And culturally, we have this disconnect with Punjab because we didn't grow up in that space. And that is a problem. The best example I can think of when you guys were speaking is English is the crutch. Like English translation is the crutch. Your leg is broken and you're on crutches walking. The goal is to fix your leg and get rid of the crutches. The goal isn't to carry on walking on the crutches and give up and
break everyone else's legs.
Yeah, or break everyone else's legs. The goal is to, heal yourself and heal that fracture, heal that wound, and move forward, and you can only move forward without those crutches. And, I'll give you another example. So my dad, as I mentioned before, he grew up in Singapore. He was born in Singapore because of colonization, because my grandfather was in, the Singaporean naval police force. And there was a whole bunch of them that the Gore had brought over, and they had built a base, and they, built some apartments, and all of these Singaporean, all these Punjabi Sikhs that were in service of the British Empire were all living in this complex, and their kids were born there. and their kids, grew up in Singapore, eating the food, the Singaporean people ate, and speaking the language of Singaporean people, and speaking Malay, and obviously like speaking, English and Punjabi at home, where the parents spoke English and Punjabi at home. So my dad didn't learn Punjabi as his first language. He learned like the Malay language, and that became, an important part of his upbringing. In order to address that problem, because the ਜਿਹੜੇ Sikh Sipahi sige, like those police officers and soldiers, they realized that this is a problem. In order to address it, they bought a Granthi from Punjab and housed the Granthi in the apartment building, and got the Granthi to teach their children Gurmukhi and Sakhiyan and like Part, and built a Gurdwara. And that's how Sikhs have addressed the problem. The same way that when Sikhs came to the UK, they built Gurdwara. They, till this day, we bring over Jathe from Punjab, Kirtni Jathe, Kathā Parchāraks, the same people that are doing Parchar in English, the same organizations, the Sanstama, their Parcharaks are learning Santhya. So it's much better to look at the methodology. And I watched some of that interview. I need to watch the rest of it. And I did watch some of the translation video. And I was quite like, well, let's just, I'll hold my opinions in reserve until I've watched the whole thing. But one thing stood out to me immediately when Satpal Singh translated hukam as divine law. Like, to me, that just sums up like the limitations of the language and the limitations of that approach of trying to understand Gurbani and trying to use, Western ideas and, ideas that are rooted in Western philosophy, and in order to understand and dissect Sikhi rather than doing it the other way around. There's a video that we can link in the description by Professor Kamaljeet Singh called Gurbani de vich hukam ate nadar. And in there talks about what hukam is and how hukam leaves a space for nadar, for Akal Purkh's kirpa, to happen in the world. And he describes hukam as ik drishti, a way to view and understand the world. And I find that divine law framing, like, it makes sense when you're, looking at it from that kind of Angrez lens, because what's higher than divine law, right? And, looking at Akal Purkh as separate from their creation, but is really limiting. And, I think one of the best translations I've read of Japji Sahib is by Osho. And Osho, as pagal as Osho was, and like, or should I say as wild as he was, if anyone hasn't seen that documentary, it's pretty interesting watching. But yeah, Osho wrote a book about translating Japji Sahib, and he does all this translation, he puts so much effort into it. And in the end, he's like, you can't translate Japji Sahib. He's like, it's really difficult to do, but he's like, I've tried, right? And it is, it's like that thick, and he's tried to, explain ideas and concepts. And you can see from Osho, his entire messaging that, he's drawing from, Sikh ideas that, are present within Gurbani, and then, repackaging them and, becoming the Guru himself, But that book is a really great example of, if you were to translate Japji Sahib into English, what that would look like. And, you can't do a word for word translation. And I think the dynamic that Faultlines try to do is have this kind of question and answer. And, the bits that I watched of the interview is like the Sid Ghost thing. And he has to introduce like this questioner to ask these questions. And, and then the issue is people are watching this and then thinking they now have understood some level of gyan of Japji Sahib without actually doing the kamai of Japji Sahib. Like, Gurbani is an abhyas, and it's really important that it's tied to the language. And, one of Dr. Sevak Singh's lectures, when he talks about how we should read and connect to Gurbani, and he talks about the importance of sitting down and doing Gurbani, like, taking a time to read Gurbani, and the act of reading it from a gutka is so important. And, I was being one of those guys that, did part from my phone, and, until I watched that, and I was like, you know what, 100% this is correct. The phone is a massive problem, and it cannot, Gurbani cannot be done and should not be done from the phone. Chalo je kite majboori aa jaye, if you're Garib and you don't know Gurbani mujawani, then it's, you rely on your phone, right? But a Gutka Sahib is so important. And that, like, when I've been reading the Gutka Sahib, like, it's amazing, man. It's like looking at the letters and the way those letters are. they're more familiar to me than my own reflection. And that's like a weird thing to say, but I can see, like, you know, past, present, future. I can see my parents in those letters, in the script, in the way they're written. It's just something about it, you know, it's profound and it speaks to you. You know, jo dhyan nal paath padhde hain, you know, is your boli of your guru. Like, you know, Guru Sahib spoke those words. All of your shaheeds throughout your ityas have spoken these words. They carry so much weight, and this is why we have so much reverence for Gurbani. It's not because you know, we're like the Gore think that we're backwards people and we, you know, worship a giant book. You know, that's not the case at all. The reverence that we have for Gurbani is it cannot be held in English. You can't translate Sri Guru Granth Sahib Ji into English because ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ concept ਹੀ ਨਹੀਂ ਹੈਗਾ, like ਬਿਲਕੁਲ ਸੰਕਲਪ ਨਹੀਂ ਹੈਗਾ, like to understand what a guru is to the Sikhs. Like if we were talking about translation, Guru Granth Sahib Ji, the equivalent of that does not exist in English. Like the word Sikhs use are holy scriptures or holy book. Guru Granth Sahib Ji is neither of those things. The holy book and the sacred scriptures is Christian ideas. You know, what Guru Granth Sahib Ji is, and
what the Guru, even the Guru, what the Guru means.
Yeah,
it's not teacher.
Yeah, what the Guru Granth Sahib Ji and the relation that the Sikh has with the Guru and they have with each other, it exists in that world. And it's not something that can be, you know, taken out of that world, stripped from its context, its roots and its heritage, and put in a sterile environment and said, you know, now here is the equivalent of it. No parallel can be drawn.
You know, you pretty much answered the question, but does anyone want to add any further to what some people would say, that in English, we could get the message across wider to the whole world? Everyone can become Sikh, something like that. What would you guys say to that argument?
You know, just building upon that metaphor that you mentioned earlier, Shamsher, saying about the crutches, right? The way I was thinking about it was like, you know, translation, even just by its definition, translation is never supposed to be the end final destination, right? The translation it's like a bridge, isn't it? It's supposed to take you from here to essentially get you there. And I think what we've done over the years is we've tried to build better bridges. And we've said that, you know, this bridge is like problematic because of the foundation is based upon this material, and this material is not going to be, it's not like sustainable, right? Because of X, Y, and Z. So so now we've got this other bridge now. The purpose was to get to like that destination. We're like just jumping on these different bridges. And I think the point you said earlier also about, you mentioned hukam, right? And this translation of divine law. When you hear the words divine law, instantly your reference is Christianity. Your reference is that whole dunya. So you're giving legitimacy to this world as the normal, neutral default. I think we've spoken about this before, haven't we? Like, I feel as though it's like a Groundhog Day with regards to like colonialism, and that's like the neutral. And then everything is like, okay, how can we make sense of this with that as our reference point? But with Gurbani, this is the whole purpose, is that it's revealing a whole new way to view the world, to view the whole of Kainat, to view the whole of everything around us, the seen and the unseen, right? And you won't get that in English, like you're saying. I'm completely with you. So I think like attempts to translate as well intended as they may be are ultimately flawed, because one, you're knowingly or unknowingly giving legitimacy to whatever it is you're translating to. And also, like, it's not helping the Sikhs going forward. Like, I was watching, I don't know if you guys have seen it on Netflix, the Jose Mourinho 3-part documentary. Like, really famous football manager, Chelsea's managed like all the top teams across Europe, right? And he goes from England, and he goes to play in, like, he manages in Italy and in Spain. And what he does is he goes to these places and he's like a serial winner, and he speaks about going to Italy. He goes, oh, when I went to Italy, I wanted to learn like Italian because I wanted to learn the bully. And so he goes and he learns the bully to the point where he's in his press conferences. You watch him, he's speaking and responding it as a culturally Italian, as an Italian would do in light of the cultural context. So he's not giving them like, you know, one-worded answers, and the media are like blown away by it. And he does the same in Spain. Like, he uses specific Catalonian references within that regards to Barcelona. So he's put the udam towards, you know, for his craft. Why are we not applying the same, you know, why are we not spending time within Santya, within the spaces, absorbing ourselves, within that world. And it's the same with anyone who wants to learn a language. They say that you can't really learn it through a book, right? You have to go and immerse yourself in that culture, in that environment. And I think the same science, same logic applies here.
And I think, like the elephant in the room is this idea of modernity.
Yeah.
That if we believe that things which are coming up or different or the newer things are better, then inherently we're going to look at our practices, our time-tested practices of Santhya as maybe not the best way of doing things. Whereas, these things are timeless. And I forgot what point I was going to make. But yeah, the points you guys made about the bridge and the crutch, I think it's brilliant, because I started off reading the transliterations, doing the Gurmat Sahib, with the transliterations in it. And as long as as long as you're, like you're saying, acknowledging that this is a majburi, this is Sadi Halati Dandiya, and that I wish to strive to get to Gurmukhi as quick as possible. And the other thing as well is have that faith in Guru Sahib. This idea about it being irreversible. Like us, Maharaj can teach us, give us Sikhi, give us Gurbani, give us Santhya. And just thinking of some of the examples as well, Shamsher, that example about Singapore was amazing. And it reminds me of, there was a Sakhis, the Singhs were telling us about when they went to Jodhpur after the attack in 84, and many of the survivors, the Jujadus, they were taken and to far-flung jails like in Jodhpur, and they were tortured mercilessly, and they weren't allowed to do like Simran or Bhat. Obviously, they weren't going to give them good kasabs, because even if they heard us doing like Waheguru Simran, they would like beat us. And he said that those of us who we were able to do our Nithanim, because but there were some younger ones, and some also Sikh arm he goes, some of those guys, they struggled. And he goes, what we did then, he goes, that in the cells they had water pipes which were not connected, so they had no water. He goes, but through the water pipes we did Santhya. And then by the end, he goes, all of the things were like cunt. So if they can do it in those kind of circumstances, we can do something.
Just before you finish, Billy, earlier you mentioned that's a like amazing Saki, by the way. Like, it just gives you goosebumps just thinking about it. But you said majburiya earlier, right? Just because we had specific, or we had particular majburiya, doesn't mean to say that like the next generation needs to go through that same like sequence. Because I'll give you an example. Like our Fridays in Glasgow, we have Santhya classes, right? And it's amazing how like kids as young as like 6, 7, 8 are now, doing their Santhya. They're reading Gurbani, in Gurmukhi. There's no like middle, there's no like the transliteration, there's no English translation. They're just doing it. So it just goes to show that, whatever we've learned perhaps growing up, as like second, third generation diaspora, whatever we've gone through. Because I'm like, I started with the transliteration. And when I took Khandi Dipol, I realized like I was pronouncing most of it incorrect. Because obviously there's, like we said in the previous podcast, for da, they don't exist in English, right? So English is limited anyway. But just because we've gone through that process doesn't mean to say that the next generation needs to follow that sequence. It could, we should be pushing, I think, as much as we can for the youth to engage with Sikhi and learning Gurbani through those indigenous, methods such as Santhya and Katha and going to the Gurdwara.
And that one of the other things with the translation is, you can start with the translations or so-called translations, because they're not translations. Then you have to unlearn all of those translations, and you have to unlearn the worldview of those translations. Ascribe a gender to Akal Purakh, use Christian language to convey, and you can learn Gurmukhi, which is a crazy phenomena, that you can learn Gurmukhi, you can have Shuddh Santhya and still rely on the English translations for your understanding, which I've come across Sikhs like that read Gurmukhi really, really well, and have Shuddh Ucharan, but their understanding is still tied to the Trumpian, colonist translation. And there are much better resources in Punjabi, even like the apps that you have multiple, translations
in Punjabi,
in which, they offer a completely different viewpoint and a completely different standpoint when they are looking at what Gurbani is trying to convey. And then you've got Bhai Gurdas Ji's Vara, and then you've got, Mahan Kosh, you've got, Pant Prakash, you've got all of the Sakhiyan that you can read. And, you've got, Bhai Khan Singh's, Shabad Arth, and, there's so much resource available if you want to get into the depth and of Gurbani and, why Gurbani is structured in the way it's structured, what ideas and themes are reoccurring, what is it that the Guru Sahib wants to teach you. And then again, for me, I'll come back to Sant Janel Singh to see Gurbani in motion, to see Gurbani being lived and expressed in the world. You cannot disconnect the Sangharsh from that. And I think the English Parchaar, like, Punjabi Parchaar today, it exists in its own sphere and its own world. Like, Sant Janel Singh would say, like when someone asked him, I think Baljeet Singh, you were telling this story, but when someone asked Sant Janel Singh, when are we going to get Sikh Raj? And Sant Janel Singh says, Jado kirtani kathā vach ktadi sare Sikh banenge. Like, you can't separate the world of Sikhi from the language itself, even in Punjabi. So that becomes a problem in that space. And like this modernity argument, right? Like, the best way I've heard it described to me is by, Professor Rajbir Singh Judge, about modernity being a dot on the graph that claims to be the whole graph. And he's like, modernity isn't about technology, and it's not about like time, about like, the quality of being so-called modern. It has an economic system that's obviously tied to capitalism. It has, a particular way of understanding underlying philosophy. It has, different components that make up what modernity is. And those can't be separated out. It's not just about technological advancement, because I would argue the technology of Sikhi is far more advanced than anything the West has been able to produce, because the goal of technology should be the flourishing of humanity. And the West simply doesn't have the technology to flourish humanity. Like literally in this country right now, we're living through like the 5th, heat wave and a drought because of, exploitative economic practices that have treated the world as, a resource to be exploited, and that's fundamentally altered the world's environment. And now we're living through, environmental consequences that are only going to get more and more severe. And you'll see the impact on the landscape and on people, because they're not separate; they coexist together. But yeah, jumping ahead now, I think to an important aspect, which is like the online influencers, and particular, like, the Canada problem, shall we say, because I think some of the, online influencers, like for me, why, like, another reason why the Parchaar conversation is so important is because I watched a few of the videos of, and I'm sorry for sharing them with you guys as well, is that this guy called E Squared, and he's made a few videos, and he made some videos, and he's made like, this ongoing like beef with basics of Sikhi. And I just find it really upsetting, like somebody that, can use the language that he's using. And I'm not talking about the swear words. I don't have a problem with the swear words, that's, Oda pare unne chakkanaya. What I have a problem is the, the values and the words he's using to describe Gursikhs. I think like in, he's got this, for anybody that doesn't have context, you can go watch, the videos that this guy's watching. I'm sure people are watching those because, people like that type of controversy, and it becomes popular because of Kaljug, right? But he's got this ongoing like controversy and like this beef and, back and forth. Well, it's not a back and forth because I don't think basics of Sikhi have acknowledged or responded to it in any way. But yeah, he's, declared war on basics of Sikhi. He's got a problem. And as part of that, he's used like the most foul, like horrible ways to talk about fellow Gursikhs. He does this thing where he talks and he puts stuff on the screen, and he puts a picture of all the basics of Sikhi Parchariks, and he goes through them one by one, and like one he says really bad things, and he says about Sukhdeep Singh in particular. He says, "Oh, look at this low T Singh," and it's like, I don't think this guy's ever exchanged 2 words with Sukhdeep Singh. Sukhdeep Singh would bench press this guy through a 2nd-story window. Like he has no idea.
What does low T mean, man? My age is showing, but what does low T mean?
It's as part of this online culture, which is, he's saying that he's got low testosterone, basically, like na mardya. You know what I'm saying, bro? Like Sukhdeep Singh, I think does he still train in Olympian, where like literal beasts walk around like unleashed, man? Like it's, you know, I mean, you can have critiques of basics, you know, that's fine. You know, like basics isn't a perfect Sikh organization. No Sikh organization is perfect. I'm sure basics are aware of their flaws, and, you know, are interested in improvement. You know, the problem isn't having a critique. The problem is like the way he's speaking. And the thing is, I think why this is relevant to Parchaar is because he will say very clearly, and he said multiple times, that I am not a Parcharak, I'm not doing Parchaar. The problem is the star that he's wearing on his head doesn't belong to him. It's a Guru di dastar ya. Dara jara prakash kita, o vi Guru da ya. The bandana that he's wearing on top of it is the star, chalo o oda ya. But when Sikhs are watching your content, when you're talking about Sikhi, it's very easy to take this like position of I'm not a Parcharak, but I'm now free to say whatever I want to say about anybody in any way. And I think it's unique to online space because like, you know, I've been thinking about it.
And the thing is, you know, when Parchaar is happening online, where attempts are being made to do Parchaar online, and you're working in that same space, talking about the same topics, you can't then say, I'm not a Parcharak, but I'm going to just flood the airwaves with, you know, my message on Sikh concepts or Sikh topics, but you can't have a clause and say, well, I'm not a Parcharak, because you're having that same impact, isn't it?
And you're messing with the same space, right? And like the same, because he says it very clearly, like, you know, he'll say like things like, you know, don't listen to me. I'm just, you know, I'm degenerate. I'm, you know, nothing. And I'm going to point you into this direction. And the direction he's pointing you at is, he's like, go listen to Jawala, go listen to, you know, Arvind Par Mandair, go listen to Nanak Nam. And, you know, we can, you know, talk about how problematic, you know, we've spoken about some of that.
Also read my book.
Yeah, and he's monetizing the content, which is another aspect of like the online space. But like, you know, Sikh academia is not neutral, and Sikh academia doesn't speak to Sikhs. You know, Arvind Pal Mandair, like the work that he's done is phenomenal. You know, some of it, but Arvind Pal Mandair exists in a world that exists to speak to whiteness. That is who the audience of Sikh academia is. Arvind Pal Mandair has been in a space for his entire career that has called Janel Singh and Awkarku Shaheeds terrorists, and problematizes and doesn't even know how to understand Khalistan or Janel Singh. Like, forget like any deeper concepts of, you know, Sikhi or Gurmat or whatever. They see a complete disconnect. And why Sikh academia is subordinate to that structure. And yeah, there are things that are happening in Sikh academia that are trying to push back against the erasure and the violence, but it is an inherently violent space, you know. It is, but yeah, and like you know, the issue with that is being in this online space, and you know, and how different that is from being in Sangat. Like the way people speak in that online space is not how you would speak in Sangat. And if you did speak in Sangat, people would not like it because you don't speak to people in that way. You don't have like a completely unfiltered, you know, you might swear in your personal life. I may swear, you know, I may be like, you know, what do they call it in Ingreji, a potty mouth. You know, I might be a potty mouth in, you know, my personal life, but I'm not going to come online and, you know, speak in that way, because it's just, you know, so bani dindi, right? You know, when you wear a dastar and a dari, you know, immediately, like, you know, we're talking about Professor Puran saying, and, you know, that this is the Parchaar, this Swaroop is the Parchaar of the Sikhi, right? Like this Swaroop has a profound meaning and it's not yours. You know, and I think, you know, the E thing is really interesting because I see it as like a Canada problem. Like, you know, the Canadian diaspora. Bro, the Canadian diaspora is on a completely different wavelength. Like, we grew up here in the UK, and Singhs were never disrespected. Even by Monne, even by other Singhs, Singhs were always respected. If you were a Singh and you were doing Putte Kam, you could catch shit there from a Singh or a Munna. It was just as likely, because, you know, you could be a Singh and, you know, be in like spaces where you weren't supposed to be and doing things that you weren't supposed to do, and people would be upset by that.
Pull you up, yeah.
They'll pull you up. They'll Singh, like, why are you doing this? But in Canada, they use Gyani as a slur. And E does that, right? Like, it's, in salting the Surup, it's become part of their vernacular. And I don't even think there's an introspection of why that, self-hate language is used in that way. I think it's all to do with Air India because, because of Air India happened and, there was this massive exposure about Sikhs, the white gaze, and that white gaze then reversed, in the form of bullying. So they grew up in a place where self-hate was enforced within multiple different arenas of whiteness, the school, the workplace, etc. So then they developed that language of the Gyani, which then, denigrates Sikhi Sarup and makes it laughable. And like the thing with E is, and I'm sorry I'm going on like this, like, complete like side rant, but the thing with E is like he's trying to say that he's talking about Sikhi and he's talking as a Sikh, but he's not though. He is talking about E. His world isn't the cosmology of Gurmat. His world is the world of E, like Ekonkar, his own sphere and his own understanding. And the funny thing about that is in that world, he wants you to be, sexually promiscuous. He wants you to be, have high testosterone and, like, he wants you to be like, this version of masculine and money obviously is very important in that world. He wants you, to have money, and he makes one video where he mocks, in part of the whole basics thing where he mocks somebody, doing kathā, about a Sant Mahapurk and says, well, if your Mahapurk's so great, why can't he do stock picks? Because in that world, like, money is, top. And that should give you some clues to, that isn't actually, in fact, E's world. That is the world that Bell Hooks, in my opinion, describes so accurately as the white supremacist capitalist patriarchy. That is the world of the Farangi. That is the world of Andrew Tate. That is the world of all of this stuff. So the culture that he's promoting is so alien and so opposite to Sikh culture in the attempt of claiming to offer this super, like this masculine, this like esoteric, this real kind of unfiltered Sikhi, but really it's just a subordinated junior partner white world that you're getting. You're not even getting Sikhi, and you're not even capable of signposting people towards Sikhi because like English translation cannot hold the weight of Sikhi. That world cannot hold, even the reflection or the shadow of Sikhi. And that's why it becomes okay for him to speak about women in the way he does, which again is like massively problematic. The way he speaks about women is literally the objects of sexual desire. And, this is, there's something to be extracted from, and the only relationship that you can have with a woman is one of where she is the object of your fantasies and your desires. And he sees that as somehow, not being a Gyani, like, you should, what did he say at one point? Like, I believe that, premarital sex is great, right? Well, you might do, but what does Sikhi say about these ideas? The stuff that you're signposting, what are the qadra, the qeemata, the values of the place that you're saying go to and look at, and, go through this, his world. So yeah, I just found it like really like kind of, disappointing, I guess, to see, Gursikhs that have, spent their entire lives, that have like pakka rehni behni, that wake up at Amrit Vela, that, do their kamai, and that are on a path, that have skin in the game, that aren't separate from the sangat, that exist in the sangat.
I thought the same thing. I find it deeply offensive, but also I can't understand this thing where on one hand I'm a degenerate, I'm this, but on the other hand I want to have a surup written, and I'm like, where are we kind of where do you get the courage to say these things at the same time? How can you speak about Gursikhs in the same way you do, the kind of vulgarity of your words, etc., and at the same time you want to save the panth and you want to write books about it, or you want to, I couldn't believe he said that he wants to commission having a Hathlit's Surup written. I'm like, I don't think maybe you're the guy for this project, bro. Like maybe you shouldn't. But I think one of the things that comes from this issue and other kind of similar issues is when you were talking about Prachar in the past, I said this in a previous podcast that if you take sovereignty or like Padshah out of Sikhi, none of them make sense to me. And Prachar is one of those things. And I'll give you an example of that is back in the, like earlier, like whenever we've had elements of Raj is when Gursikhs have flourished and Sikhi has flourished. So when we think of Sanjay Singh and we think of the hundreds of Gursikhs that came through their Sangat and the Sangat of their Gursikhs, it was because from from the early 80s, they were able to have some sort of infrastructure where they were based, where Singhs and Singhia could be jatheband. We could come together, and all of the issues were taken care of. That's the difference. Sanjay Nasanji would say this, that if ਤੁਸੀਂ ਕੋਈ ਦੋਸਤ ਨੂੰ ਝਟਕਾਤਾ, to come to me, I'll handle everything. To the point where that the Gursikhs that were underground, when they used to come to Sanjay Singh, their lands would be mowed. Like, kheti jo bhi, all the farming that needs to be taken care of would be taken care of. Because Sanji would send Singhs and they would look after their lands. So it's so important to have that. That's why obviously Parchaar is so important in Sikhi, because it's from those spaces where people, like through the Sangat, but like if you want to call them Parchariks, but Gursikhs would emerge right through that Sangat. They would then become like Bibi Bimal called Sanjay Singh, the Chan and Manara, like towers of light. It's not Sikhi, like you said earlier. We have to do a bias of it. It's not something it's not knowledge that you can learn and now I understand, isn't it? Now I'm the one. So I think that's where people are kind of mistaken as well. And I think that's the issues we're having there. So in terms of how do you become a pracharak in the UK? Is it a course you go on? Is it, how long is the study? Whereas in Punjab and Sikhi traditionally, was by Fauja Singh a pracharak? He was a Gursikh who emerged from the Sangat, who due to his Sikhi, his Parchaar came out. He didn't do lectures and things like that. Like he did Parchaar, but most of his Parchaar was his, like we were saying before, his living, his actions, and people could learn from that. And when we kind of dissect that and take that away, so this online situation, we're out of Guru's Hazuri. We're out of that space, and that space is where everything comes from. So, and even he, self-proclaimed degenerate, admitted that when he was in the Darbar, that's where he goes, I wasn't like this, I wasn't like that. He claims, we don't know, I wasn't there. But the language was straight away moderated, right? His language, his behavior. And he was appalled that someone offered to fight him or something. So you see, as soon as he came into like the Guru Sharan, straight away, even Otabi, that are like that subliminal, that kind of like, we have that thing that, the understanding that there's a different, better way to behave. And I think when we take the Huzuriya of Maharaj away from these things, then I think that then these kind of problems arise.
I think it kind of highlights the issues of the way Parchaar is going in terms of the growth of this social media influencer, because that's how I would categorize somebody like him. Because one, there's this kind of silo that's been created, right? Because you're online, there's no accountability really. Even though you might go to the Gurdwara every so often, you're not going to be speaking in this way. Sikha da kirdar hunda hai, like gal karna da tarika hunda hai. Like there's, as Gurpais, on the one hand, we're talking about all these like high ideals, and then the same token where using such like derogatory language or of Bibia, of other Gursikhs. You can have an issue with a certain pracharak, you can have an issue with what they've said, and no doubt we over the years have had concerns that we've raised even with basics and even with other organizations. But you never go on this like online tirade of like behaving in this way. I think the problem for me is maybe it's a new generational thing. I don't know, maybe it's just because we're getting old, right? But it almost as if like, because he's being honest, or not honest, and that's not even the right word, because he's being, what's I'm looking for? Because he's just being like no holds barred.
Brazen, yeah.
Perhaps there's some like, something there to be like celebrated in a really weird way. But it's just that you've got baseline. There are certain things there are certain like protocols, not even protocols, certain just things you do out of common sense. So if you've got an issue with someone, earlier we were speaking about translation and Sapal Singh's recent work, there's a concern there. So we'll raise it. And if there's an opportunity to sit down with them, you sit down with them, have a discussion as Gurpais. You don't go on like online, where it's completely unfiltered, unregulated, and start talking nonsense. It doesn't like, that shouldn't fly in any situation. So I think like with him and maybe even others who are perhaps, following that, because it's reflective of that space, isn't it? Like, sensationalism sells, right? Clickbait sells, having certain titles, taking up a respected Gursikh, again, whether you agree or disagree with them, and then putting like, devil horns on them, whatever it is, that's just like unbecoming of a human, let alone a Sikh. So, him saying that he's a self-proclaimed degenerate, I think he's just not being genuine. Like, you can't say these things and say, oh, I'm just learning, or who am I to speak, and then go ahead and speak so bad.
We're forgetting as well, like, no disrespect to Sukhdeep Singh and the others, but this is, have you seen the way he's spoken about by Sabramdev Singh? Right. And it's like, it's just, just looking at that and just thinking, oh my God, it's terrifying to keep up to and stuff. But, this idea as well that Sikhi is Gamad, right? Sikhi is earned, and it's through the sacrifices of those Gursikhs, Jananak Sikhi Kamaiya, that Sikhi flourishes in itself. I've got two examples of that. And it might be quite, offensive what I'm going to say, but I've listened to every Sant Singh Ji speech. I've read it in Punjabi and English. And maaf karna, I wouldn't say that Sant Ji ever says anything which is like, he's very straight. He's speaking to the armed Punjabi Sikh, right? There's a difference when Sant Ji is doing kathā and Sant Ji is doing, when he's talking to the armed Sikh. And what carries the most amount of weight with Sant Singh is his Gamai. And that's why, he had that transformative effect after his life has ended, decades after. But it's not because, what I'm trying to say is, like, through Sikhi Parchaar, there's no music, there's no background music, there's no visuals, there's no memes, there's nothing like that, right? But what carries the earth-shattering effect of Sikhi Parchaar is his Kamai. That's why it has the impact it does. I can give two sakhi about that, right? One is his brother-in-laws, the brothers of Mata Pritam Kaur. They spoke about this, and Mataji spoke about this as well, that when Sanjana Singh Ji early in their marriage met the brothers, they were Amritari. The brothers were Amritari. And Sanjana Singh said to them, Tusi ko Tusi ko Amrit Shakana, like, you're my family now. And like, you guys, Tusi ni Amrit Shakana, when you guys are going to take Amrit. And they said that Sant Ji, asi jatte hain, we're farmers. Sanu hera feri karni pendi with the weights and the things and in our dealings or whatever it might be. But sanu kei vari, like, jhoot bolna penda, we need to do this, we need to do that. So sadde to nahi eh hona, right? We can't live that life. And Sant Ji haspe, and Sant Ji said, "Theek hai, let's make a deal. Sada dharam yudh morcha chal raha hai, right?" He goes, "Je o morche ch fateh hogi na." He goes, "Tusi amrit shak leo." And they said, "Theek hai." Amataji says that the day after the attack, her brothers came to her house. The eyes were they were tears in their eyes, but they had gatre around their necks. So that's the example of, like, the Sikhi kama ke da je unhone amrit shakya si, unhone amrit shakya si, unhadi shahadat to baad, right? And another example of Gursikhs from the Pind of Rodde who weren't Gursikhs before, that they and fought in the Darbasa battle, they said that every time Santi would come to the Pind, they would leave the Pind. And like, oh, he's coming back, right? So they would leave the Pind, and then one day he happened to see them, and then he called them over and they started talking to them, and he said, look, there's what's going on, like the Sangharsh is going on, the Tarmin Morcha. He goes, when you gonna see apna hissa ko na and stuff in it. And they said, Sat Bachan Santi Shaklan. And I think there's two things in that. One is that Santji's, that people were afraid of speaking to him, not because he was terrifying or he was gonna, affect, like, he was gonna insult them, offend them, or anything like that. But they just knew that if someone of that stature was to see them, and obviously if Sanji spoke to any of us, we'd do anything he said, innit? So when he just said to them, like, there's time for you guys now as well. Like, you've been running for a while. And to see Ajo come home now, innit? And they said, Tat Bachan. And the difference as well is when those Gursikhs took Amrit, where there was the Jathe that by Talwinder Singh Ji led, with Gursikhs, like, with Awa Singh, by Kalwan Singh Nagoke, like the highest of the highest, by Surinder Singh Nagoke. So when they went round and they did Prachar and people took Amrit, those people then fought and they, like, contribute to Sikhi in, like, the most amazing ways. So that's what I'm trying to say, was that, like, those are examples for me of how Sikhi is like earned, and it's not through how many, grants you've read or, translations you read or whatever. What this guy, for example, thinks he knows or he doesn't know. This is the true earning and like, wealth of Sikhi.
And I think that goes to, the question of what it is that you're trying to achieve. And I think you talked about that quite beautifully, about the Gursikhs through their Jeevan, through their Parchaar, they were trying to achieve something which is uplifting Sikhi, moving us towards a certain direction, helping us address problems. They genuinely cared about the Panth. Like Bhai Fauja Singh's, Sakhi, right? When they, when you're saying like what Prachar did Bhai Fauja Singh do, like ona da Jeevan Sikhi da Prachar saga. And, they, in that incidents that happens where they become arrested, where, there's a shopkeeper and the shopkeeper's daughter is being harassed and assaulted by this like Daku, this like Gunda. And, the shopkeeper sees Bhai Fauja Singh walking past in Bana, in Sikhi Saroop, and, onu like mena mar diya and say, Guru Gobind Singh Ji de Sikh kidda aa, where are they? I don't believe that they exist anymore. And then Bhai Fauja Singh asks him, why do you say that? And then he tells the dukh pari kahani of what's been happening to his daughter. And Bhai Fauja Singh says, I'm going to show you ke Gursikh khale jiunde, and stands with that guy. The shopkeeper waits for the Daku to come. The Daku tries to grab the daughter, and Bhai Fauja Singh tells him to let go. When he doesn't, he cuts his arm off, and then he's arrested, sent to prison. In prison, he organizes divans, and then he's released on bail. And while he's on bail, he becomes shaheed. He hears that sadda of the Nirankaris while they're doing seva in the langar, like hathona de atte de na libre hoya. One of the seva they used to do was, cleaning the lid, the feces of the sangat in like the khet, like enna ucha sucha jeevan. And look at the position of Bibiyan in Bhai Fauja Singh's jeevan and how they respected, like, kise, like somebody completely unrelated, as, people would say a bagana, right? Like, this is not my family member or mine. This, is
different faith.
Yeah, different faith, somebody completely else. But the level of pyar and satkar that they have for insaniyat, for human beings, is reflected in everything that they do. And then what they're genuinely trying to achieve is, the genuine parchar and the propagation of Sikhi through their Reni Beni, and move us in a direction. So, when you have like this online space, or these, so-called influence or whatever, what is the achievement here? If you want, like, if you're taking that example with if you want basics of Sikhi to be better or do better, there are 1,000 more effective ways of achieving that goal. Objectively speaking, like if that is genuinely your goal, if you genuinely want to uplift, if you genuinely want to move things forward, you want to see a change occurring, there is much better ways to do that. And you can have 100 different disagreements. You don't have to like people. You don't have to, agree with everything that anybody is saying. But if you're invested in that, if you want Sikhi Parchaar or the Sikh space to improve, you have to, your actions and your conduct is not separate from that. That's why, like, the Reni of a Gursikh is so central to everything that you do as a Sikh. Guru Sahib var keh rahe hai, like, the way you conduct yourself, the closest thing to you is your man, right? Like, your mind. Nobody knows the thoughts that go on in your mind when you see, like, aurtan, or you see, like, wealth, what you think of and what you cover. Nobody knows that. Guru Sahib knows, and they're trying to hold your mind in a way that is beneficial to you, because that's the closest thing. When you read your Gurbani, your tuadi awaaj de naal ਤੁਹਾਨੂੰ ਸਿਖਾਉਂਦੇ ਆ, like, how to connect to Akal Purkh, and that is the closest, most intimate space to you. And that's where Guru Sahib is concerned about, apne man nu sadar, like, your mind isn't your dushman, your mind isn't inherently deviant, man tu jot saroop hai, your mind has the capability of connecting you with Akal Purkh. These are the ways and methodologies to do it. And that is reflected in your jeevan. Like, somebody like him would see Bhai Fauja Singh and say, oh, Bhai Fauja Singh, is a low T Singh, because they wouldn't understand, right? Like, we've got so many Sakhiyan, like, Duni Chand and Bhai Pachittar Singh, right? Duni Chand, Guru Sahib kende aap mikole hathi, like, the super testosterone guy, and like, who comes and defeats the elephant, Bhai Pachittar, because it's not about those divine laws or, whatever. It's about Guru Sahib's bakshish. It's about Guru Sahib's kirpa. And Sikhi isn't
I think that's the most key thing there, bro. Like, a lot of these people, they're talking about the issues of Sikhi or this, and all of their solutions are through their own mat, innit? I think we should be doing this, like, of stock picks and all those kind of mad things, right? Like, none of it comes from a place of Sikhi. None of it comes from the Guru. Like, this is what, Maharaj is telling us, or this is what, let's take Agya from Maharaj. And like I gave the example the last time about Hari Singh Nalwa. So he's a general of an army under, like, the Khalsa Raj, right? And yet, whether he draws all his strength and all of his support, his adara, his everything is from Guru Sahib. So he wouldn't cross a river without taking hukum from Maharaj. So that's what's lost on this generation, on this type of Sikh or these types of spaces, that it's all about. And it's a Western problem, like you're saying. It's a Western problem because we're taught over here to think of, like, me and mine, innit? Like, what do I think about this? It's can you imagine the good Sikhs of the past, like, looking at someone like him, thinking that or even myself, right, that we're concerned about the Panth. And it's like when Mandeep Singh said, when he came ahead to sing over here, they don't worry about us, it was Hanutans. When someone said to Mandeep Singh that we're really worried about, like, Sikhi in Punjab, worried about this, worried about that, Mandeep Singh laughed and said, "Sanu na toda fikr Asi ta samblana, tusi apna dekho." That's no truer words were spoken.
And it also reminds me of, like, something my dad used to say about, so sadda kam kiya, as, like, so Najwan that are concerned about the Sangarsh, or concerned about, like, Sikhi, like, what Sikh should do, and, what's happening in the Panth and how we should be moving forward. My dad always used to say, sadda kam samjhauna hai, je kise di besti karni, udda hi char galan kadd ke ghar nu aa jao. Like, our job is to make people understand. Our job is to help people understand. If you want to do someone's besti, if the goal is to do someone's besti, you don't need to go through all of, jump through all the hoops and try to pretend to help people. Why don't you just swear at them and come home? And here the pretense is completely dropped, right? Like, the goal isn't to help you understand. The goal is, I'm offended, so therefore main tuadi besti karni hai. And, like, for me, like, the crux of it is how bibiyan are spoken about. Like, you can forget everything else. You can put everything else aside. If you really want to understand what is being taught here and what is this space, in particular in dealing with this influencer, is the way bibiyan are spoken about shows you whose world you're being inducted into. It's not the world of Guru Nanak Parchaar. This is the world of these, like, take de, Andrew Tate varge, like, just, I don't know, or duniya te jere boj bane hoye insaan hai, like, it's their world. The world that Guru Sahib is constantly telling you that this is not how we treat orta. And it's such a big, important part of Sikhi, because it's always driven Sikh Sangarsh, right? There's so many Sakhiyan where, Sikh rescue Bibiya from, the Mughals had taken the Bibiya, and Sikh go and rescue them and liberate those women from the, Mughal harems or whatever, bring them back to their families. And in one of those Sakhiyan, the families are the Hindu families. They bring the women back, and the Hindus say that we don't want these women to stay with us anymore because they're now unpure. They've been with the Musliman, and in order for them to stay with us, we have to do their parakya, we have to test their purity, and the way we're going to test them is through fire, because fire is the most purest element. Let's gather some dry bark and wrap the women in it and set them on fire, and the ones that survive this ritual of purification, they will be deemed pure enough, and they can, come back into their homes. The ones that burned, are burned because they're not pure. And the Sikh's response at that time isn't, okay, do what you're doing. The Sikh's response at that time is, tusi Bhagoti nu poojde ha, you worship Bhagoti, we also worship Bhagoti. Here is Bhagoti in the form of the Kirpan of the Khalsa. Whoever considers themselves worthy of doing this test of purity, step forward, let Bhagoti grace your neck. And if you survive the blessing of Bhagoti, then you're deemed pure enough. So it's always been at the crux of respecting Bibiyan is been fundamental to Sikhi, because we're striving for a different world order. And a world order in where women are subordinate is the world order that is being the problem. It's the same issue that the Mughals had. Mughal kol kera raj nahi saga, ja paise di kami nahi sagi. Like, the issue isn't money. The issue isn't acquiring material wealth. The issue is how power is experienced and felt. And for Sikh power is through halimmi, through mulammi, through nimrata, through pyar. That is how Sikh power is felt. I always give the example of, the House of Commons, right, where they have the golden mace, that represents the power and the authority of the monarch. And the mace is a brutal weapon. It's designed to crush brutally family, and that's how the power of the monarch is experienced. That's how the power of the Mughal Raj was experienced. That's how the power of the modern nation state is experienced, through genocide, through violence, through displacement, through borders, through various different technologies that brutalize and dehumanize. And that isn't the technology or the way or the world of Gursikhi. And you can understand that through how those that have less power than you are treated. So, when Guru Sahib says, those that are powerless, those that are considered the lowest of the low, ਅਸੀਂ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਖੜਦੇ ਹਾਂ, ਨੀਚੇ ਅੰਦਰ ਨੀਚ ਜਾਤ, ਨੀਚੀ ਹੂੰ ਅਤ ਨੀਚ. Like, that is an important barometer. But yeah, I just want to end it at that. And obviously that wasn't like the topic of the conversation, but I think it's irrelevant because those online influencers are trying to denigrate efforts that Sikhs are making. And obviously you can see from this whole video, our issue with English Parchaar is, self-evident. And you can have a critique, but you don't need to, insult BBI. You don't need to, insult entire Jathebandi and generalize the way, he generalizes about Akhand Kitni Jatha and Taksal and, all the rest of it. And it's like, the Akhand Kitni Jatha produced, Sur mein, like by Anok Singh Babbar and by Fauja Singh. Yeah, the Akhand Kitni Jatha today may have, many issues, but the Akhand Kitni Jatha still till this day provides such a valuable space for Sikhs, their families, to engage with Gurbani and Gurmat in these ways, through experiencing Kirtan, through experiencing, the warmth of Guru Sahib's Darbar. I grew up in a Akhand Kitni Jatha family, and, my most, treasured memories of my childhood are, falling asleep in a Ranspine, like listening to Kirtan, the whole night, and how that stayed with me, and how that's given me so much space to learn about Sikhi. And like, the Taksal, you could talk about the Taksal today and the different problems, and the Taksal is the space where Santhya is held and Santhya is conveyed. Like so many of our Kathavachaks and Taddis learn Vidya from Taksal. Till this day, Gursikhs learn Vidya from the infrastructure that, these Jathebandiyan like the Akhand Kitni Jatha, like the Taksal, like Nahang Samparda have set up. And, you don't have to, look at all of it and say, oh, I'm going to take all these pieces. If you want to learn about, like, Prat and Atiyas, Katha, like look at Gyani, Jangbir Singh and Gyani Sher Singh. They teach you valuable information. Doesn't mean that Gyani Sher Singh is a perfect human being and, is completely without flaws. That's not the argument that's being made here. You can learn about Sikhi from multiple different sources, and the mark of intelligence isn't, this like, unfiltered language. The mark of intelligence is genuinely engaging with Sikhi in a powerful way.
I think it's also quite telling that people are deeming this to be like an appropriate way to have that critique, or to offer whatever their perspective of their version of, like, Sikh at the house or Sikhi. What you guys have mentioned, the book that, this guy's spoken about, and all these ideas, grand ideals. It just shows us that shift. Like at the start of this conversation, we were speaking about Parchaar and what Parchaar is, and there's different mediums of Parchaar, and there's the what you would call maybe the quote unquote traditional methods and modes of Parchaar. And now in this age, because of social media, because of YouTube, because of the appeal of, like, mass, hitting the mass in one video with all these, that now is becoming the driving force. So, like, that's what I'm saying. Like, rather than if there was a genuine concern there, that's now lost, because what's taken over is the way in which that's been raised. And then it's been, like I said, marketed a certain way, and the views and let's look at some of the comments. It's just a horrible space. So you just got to be genuine. I think you can't claim to, on the one hand, be a Sikh and speak about Sikhi, but then also say, I'm not a Sikh, I'm a degenerate, because then you're not like beyond any critique either yourself. Like it's like a non-Sikh occupying this space and speaking about Sikhs. Like we should hold this. I think we hold the same.
But it's also, I think the E stands for ego, because this whole thing comes from such an egotistical space. Because I've got two examples I want to raise on that. One is like this holy war that he's waging has come out because they've said something, or whatever. He's super insulted by it, offended by it. And the other thing is, like, the Akhand Kitni Jatha and the Dandam Taksal, if they have issues, they have issues. They recognize those issues. They're working on that. But what do you think your video is going to do? Like you think but that's the solution. You know, like the Piri Dar Piri, you know, like these Yathebandiyas have been passed down, and like, you know, Shahadatan, they're built on the blood and bones of like Gursikhs, right? But what they need is your YouTube video to solve the riddle or solve the problem. It just comes from, you know, I mean, I couldn't even bring myself to like to critique them publicly like that. Like it's unreal. I mean, we would never do it in that way, but I'm just saying to have that kind of I mean, I feel bad enough talking about the Shaheeds, you know, given like the difference in between my Jeevan and their Jeevan, which is why I don't try to talk to anyone about like what they should do or what they shouldn't do. But it's just for me, just so much ego. And again, there's one thing like I want to like, you know, my last thing I want to say on this is that the most important thing that was said today was that Sikhis earn, right? Kamai, Sheila, you spoke about Abhyas, and Jagdeep Singh Faridkot said this thing. He said that Lokano, you guys think that everything is from knowledge or going to the universities and this, that, the other, this world knowledge that you guys talk about. He goes, if that was the place where true Kamai is earned, right? He goes, then Jere Sade Yodaya Sade Mahapurkya, he goes, oh, university chan nikal. He goes, they don't, because they come from Dala cho nikal, Taksala cho nikal, Jathya cho nikal. That's where, you know, we've got to look at like how we can foster that kind of environment where, you know, we can foster Sikh.
Yeah, I think we've spent way too much time on this particular thing, but it's important, like Shira was saying, like, you know, it's important to address it because it seems to be a growing kind of influence behind it as well. And the last thing I would say is that there's one particular thing he makes reference to in a few of his videos with regards to basics of Sikhi, and he says this thing about like Jagraj Singh, and like, you know, Jagraj Singh was legit, and everything after him has been like whatever, right? And there's a lot of lies within that as well, like, you know, talking about Gursikhs that we know, that we lived in Hayes and stuff. We were very close. We had fallings out with Jagraj Singh, and, you know, we were also, but we never got to the stage where it was like this level of disrespect. So there's a lot of lies within it as well. But I think because it is this new generation that, you know, he's appealing to, but it's just not genuine at all, and it's just not the way you do things. If you've got a concern about something that,
and sorry to jump in there, but at the height of our, like, you know, I'll speak for myself, right? Like, dispute with Jagraj Singh, like his most highest critique of us was that he wanted us to do more. He wanted us to go full time. He wanted us to like do this, commit to this full time, right? That was the highest. That's how hard it got. And his most harshest insult was calling us the Khalistani Coffee Club, right? And if you compare that to like the ganda that's being, you know, put out on YouTube today, it's just unreal.
Guys, I think we've gone too much into this, man.
Probably.
I think we've spent too much time on this. I don't feel comfortable speaking about this guy so much, man.
We can cut it though.
I think what we were speaking about before was sick, man. The Parchaar stuff, I was really enjoying that. I'm not even concerned about him cutting. It's just that we're giving him too much space, man. Like if he is genuine, then come along, have a conversation. But it's not, man.
If we make it more about the phenomenon rather than him, because we're going to see a rise of this, isn't it? We're going to see a rise.
Are we? I mean, I don't know, man. It's like,
it's going to get worse. It's going to get worse. And I think we should leave all of this in because, you know, like it is, it's an important point of debate, right? Like, you know, how much time is given, you know, to this. And this is probably why basics haven't responded, because they see it as, you know, beneath them, you know, to respond, which I don't think is the correct approach. I think, you know, there has to be, you know, engagement. You know, if we're putting so much effort into, you know, English translation and, you know, doing Sikhi Parchaar, and, you know, within us, the dynamic is messy. It doesn't benefit us as a panth collectively. And I don't think, like, you know, ignoring, you know, if the swearing and, you know, the gand is bad, like the ignoring isn't, like, you know, the solution to that either. And it is going to get worse because we've seen this phenomenon develop. And, like, you know, the stuff that, you know, he talks about as, I watched another video of his where he's with Beyant Singh, and they're talking about the Sikh Hall of Fame. And that's really revealing as well, because in there, you know, they go through all of, like, you know, the people that should be in the Sikh Hall of Fame. One of them is like Manmohan Singh, you know, the, you know, Prime Minister of Punjab, who, you know, literally signed all the checks for, you know, the genocide of the Sikhs, right? And another one is Just Rain. And they're like, you know, Just Rain is, you know, so good and blah, blah, blah. But this is where it all started. It started with with, the comedians, the super women and the Just Rains, where their comedic content was mocking their parents. And again, it's a Canada phenomena. They mocked Sikhi, they mocked their parents. They thought it was funny to take the piss out of themselves. And, the Canadian generations grew up watching that and thinking this is cool. And look how cool Just Rain is because he's, cussing, his mum. And then to where Just Rain is now, where he's taken that comedic bakwas and turned it into a TV show where, one of the pagal characters is like Babbu, who's in Sikhi Saroop. And, again, it's just really re-entrenching and reinforcing this self-hatred, this mockery of Sikhi. Like there's a trailer. I haven't seen that Late Bloomer series and I never would watch it. I saw a trailer of it, and in the trailer, Babbu is in the toilet, taking a dump and forcing it out, and then he, says I think he says a jakara or he says fateh or something.
No.
And, yeah, man. This is what this guy is saying. Like, yeah, man, Just Rain is pushed all the boundaries and has done this. It's like, bro, he's literally mocking you, your culture, everything you hold dear and valuable, and you're saying that ye bahut vadiya cheez hai. And the other phenomena, the other reason why this is so problematic. I had a call yesterday from a young Sikh who is in the online space and he's really heavily invested, and we're not, right? So we don't see it. We don't, problematize it in that way. Like we're more concerned with the larger issue of English Parchaar being a problem rather than this individual. To us, again, we're like you're saying, who is he, beneath us. But there is, the young Sikh that called me yesterday, who's really invested in this online space, in the forums and the discords and the stuff that we'd never get involved in, is talking about the impact this is having. And youngsters are watching this. It's the same reason why Andrew Tate is popular. Andrew Tate says these so-called controversial, unfiltered, raw, real truth, unmasking the matrix type of thing, and has built an entire, ecosystem and economy around it, where people are paying him money, every single month to subscribe to his course and his, pimp university, and how they're going to learn from him on how to be, high testosterone, high net worth, individuals. And again, in Andrew Tate's universe, money is God and, women are nothing. And, youngsters are learning the Tateism and the chauvinism, from somebody that, is in Sikhi Saroop, so I think it is massively problematic, especially for young teenagers that are socializing and engaging with Sikhi online, that are perpetually online, that are online in ways that we will never understand, because we remember a world before the internet, and the internet, wasn't a massive thing as it is now. So you're talking about people that have their social circles online, they're learning knowledge about Sikhi online, their recreation is online through gaming. So it's such a huge part of their world. They're spending more time online than they are in sangat, which is, a massive problem. And then you're seeing individuals like this that are denigrating sangat, that are denigrating, like you were saying, you can have 100 critiques of, basics of Sikhi or Khanki Nijata of Taksal or whatever, but equally, if not more, there's way more good things about those spaces, and none of that is reflected or shown anywhere, right? Literally the act of sitting in sangat and reading Gurbani together in, Santya form, in Kirtan form, in kathā and discourse, is so much more beneficial for your life. And that's the violent cut that's been made. And that's the same cut that Trump makes. That's the same cut that the colonial, interpreters and the translators make. It's the same level of violence that's occurring. And here is occurring through somebody that is ostensibly telling you the truth. And yeah, I think it's an issue, but we can end the episode here. But I definitely think we should leave. This.
I think there's an issue of standing as well. Like, you have to have uqad, right? You have to have some sort of legitimacy or whatever it might be. I'm not gonna advise Ranveer about his training schedule and how he trains and how that maybe he could do this better or do that better, innit? It's a joke to do that, innit? And that's why I can't marry the two things, which is, one is you're a degenerate yourself, and you have these horrific kind of ideas and thoughts and beliefs about the world, but you want to save Sikhi. And at the same, that's such a contradiction. And I think that, and I think this only happens in that space. I think if if it was like in a Sikh space, in a Sikh setting, like in sangat, this would never happen. Like Guru Sikh would be like, put going into like let's do some Jora and seva and let's
this is his whole
work on our
thing,
jeevan a little bit better.
This whole thing starts because he goes to that basics event in Canada, and according to him, when we've not heard from the other side what happened, but he says that he had some concerns he raised, and from there the entire thing escalated. Even if it escalated, even if you were called out, I'm just saying, if that happened, it still doesn't like justify this level of like this response, how lowly it is. That's why I'm saying like it feels as though we've spent too much time, not because it's below us, it's because on the one hand we're talking about Mahapurukhs like Sant Janel Singh Ji and by Fauja Singh Ji, and we've mentioned Shaheeds, and in the same time we're kind of giving this guy a bit of space. I understand it's a fine balance. I understand that there's a growing influence and people are going towards these spaces to get the Sikhi, which is a sad reflection and which is a sad reality in and of itself. But for me, I just think that it just unless we're going to call him out and say come and have a chat with us, or sit down with some Guru Sikhs in your area, look at some of the issues that you're raising, because there might be valid concerns, but this is not the way to do it. Like and that's the
thing. If he is genuine and genuinely has like dard for Sikhi, then like you should Guru Sahib de aage pesh hoke, take a hukamnama and take a direction about what you should be doing with your life, and it won't be do this, right? I get what you're saying. I'm addressing the phenomenon rather than the individual.
Yeah, fair. Yeah.
My issue is more about like that in the same way someone like him thinks like he could do Parchaar, it's completely legitimate, warranted, because I have a voice, I have a YouTube account, I can do what I want.
Well, this is the thing. He's not saying Parchaar, is he? This is where he's being a bit disingenuous, because he's saying I'm not Parchaar, I'm not this. Yeah, he's saying I'm writing this book about the neo-cults, however it is, and I'm doing I want to do a translation. I want to open a university. So it is,
I think that the axis around, there are like two issues where I think like this conversation in its entirety needs to go out. One is the axis of this conversation isn't the individual, and it's not any individual organization. It's the phenomena, and it's about Parchaar and how, and why we're talking about Guru Sikhs is because when we see Parchaar, we see it in a particular way. And when you see individuals like this, they're messing with that Parchaar and they're intersecting with it. They're encountering the Sikh world and claiming not to be Sikh, and not claiming not to be Sikh, but claiming not to be Parcharaks and claiming, don't look at me, look at Sikhi, it's amazing. So they're interacting with that world. So, they're coming into focus because of that. And then also because of the fear around this online discourse, right? People don't want to speak or say anything about this because they think it's going to get worse. And somebody like him, you'll watch this video and, make his own reaction and start taking it out and dissecting it. And I can see you smiling because that's probably what, he'll do, right? But I think for us it's different because ekta, our maturity level is different. We're not like, little kids, like you can make, you can dissect it as much. Yeah, ਸਾਡੇ ਸਿਰ ਤੇ ਕੀ ਅਸਰ ਪੈਣਾ ਅਸੀਂ ਹੰਡੇ ਹੋਏ ਆ now, it doesn't really make a difference. But I don't think that fear should be a barrier, that fear of like, oh, he's, going to ridicule you or whatever, or, it's going to get worse. It is, that's not like a metric that I understand. ਅਸੀਂ ਤਾਂ ਗੁਰੂ ਨੂੰ ਜਵਾਬ ਦੇਣਾ ਆ, like we're saying, like, ਗੁਰੂ ਸਾਹਿਬ ਨੂੰ ਪਤਾ ਹੋਣਾ ਚਾਹੀਦਾ ਸਾਡੇ ਮਨ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ, ਸਾਡੇ ਦਿਲਾਂ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ, right, ਕੀ ਆ, like, ਕੱਟ ਕੇ ਅੰਤਰ ਕੀ ਜਾਣਤ, right? Like, that's who we're concerned with. We're concerned with, responding to the legacy of our shaheeds and our surme that were genuinely invested, that, like I've heard E say this, and I've heard other people say in that space that they care about the Khalsa, they care about my fellow Khalsa. We can see what that looks like through the actions of our surme and our genuine Gursikhs that cared about it, and that looks very, very different. They're not gonna disrespect, like the Gyani slur, right? Like the way women are spoken.
Gyanan now, I never heard of that one before.
Gyanan, yeah, all this kind of stuff. Like insulting case, man. Like, the way he was talking about one of these bibbiyan, like, enna jada, like, nindan jog, like the language that he's using, like, saying, oh, and saying that bibbiyan shouldn't wear dastara because, what, they're somehow masculine because they're wearing dastara, and, like, it's a complete, like, it's just completely off the face of the planet.
The thing is, it is super relevant to the topic of Parchaar, because back in the day, and this is like an unbroken lineage of centuries, Parchaar was what it was, right? Like, this is what the message is. You never had a situation where at the same time there was another avenue where people are saying that actually you could do this, you can do that, you could do, you could do these, all these terrible things, and you'll find your kathā, I'm not kathā. So like, that's why we have to address this, because it was understood if you want to do certain kamma, then like you're out of the pant, innit? Like that's not what this pant's about. Then you can live like the rest of, like Santi said, you could live like every other like dishonorable individual. No one's gonna say anything to you. If you want to be part of this marag, then it's a different thing. But that's why I'm worried, because you see the comments as well. There's a lot of, because you don't want to give a way out to people who before accepted that they didn't have the what's the word I'm looking for, but like the metal or the character or the strength, or they just didn't have it in them to like try to live up to those kind of ideals or try to walk on this path. But now through his kind of channel and his message, people are saying, yeah, you know what, I was at the Jatha as well, and they got kicked me out because I was doing all these things, but you're right, innit? Like, it's fine to do these things. And it's like, what are you talking about? It's absolutely nuts. And just talking about the Bibia, like you're right, shit. Like he insulted like the Star Wali and Bibia and Bibia who don't cut their case, and I'm like, you just thrown thousands of Bibia into this, man, like millions of Bibia, like from our whole history. And like, how can you? It's just, and the comparing, like, he refers to himself as Khalsa, referring to, when I think of Khalsa, I think of Bayanok Singh. And there's a Gursikh told me this Sakhi that there was a Bibbi who had like done lots of seva, and she was in prison, and she wrote a dukh bari kahani to Bayanok Singh about her halat in jail. And the Pai Sahib says that I gave the letter to him, and he goes, he took the letter, and he goes, he wanted like namaskar kita si chitti, right? And he goes, he cried. And he said that he then sent a saneha by Sant Singh to the Bibbi's family and said, "But tusi hukum do, we'll break the prison, and asi uja ke unhone raha kar denge. Like, we just need your ashirwad. Like, if you give us your agya." And the Gursikh said that basically the family said that if she gets broken out, then she's going to be forever on the run, and that the case was ongoing and stuff, and we'll be able to get her out legally, or like through the legal means or whatever. That her release was pending. Essentially, they could facilitate it through the courts, and they were concerned that a Bibbi who gets broken out would have to live on the run for the rest of her life. And Bayanok Singh said, like, Sat bachan theek hai ji, like, if anything changes, let us know. But like, he was so moved that she was like in a difficult state, that she may have been like, whatever treatment she may have undergone, that he was happy to, like, and it would have been a suicide mission. Let's not make any bones about it. But he was happy to do that. And look at the difference of, like, a Bibbi that he probably never met before, and unako nakka dar siga, not like the dard siga for a fellow Sikh Bibbi. And it's like, what are we doing, man?
Yeah, miles off that. Yeah, maybe that's the reason why we've called this series Faultlines, right? Because it's not always neat. It's not always like, I'm a bit of an idealist, like self-professed idealist. So in my head, it's like, trying to, like, look towards Sikhi in a certain way. But ultimately, we are living in the milieu of, like, the dunya as well, isn't it? And the Odavi Asad Pendaya, like, and this is clearly, we're all affected by it, right? So yeah, maybe it's a fair point, that it's important to address these issues. But and I guess just on that, to end on it for me, like, if this ever gets out to him, just reach out, have a conversation with us. But where essentially what we're saying is that there's a, like I said earlier, gal karan da tarika hunda hai, like, if you have a concern, raise it in a certain way. Don't make a mockery of, like, yourself and your people and your entire history just for the sake of views, isn't it? Because that's how it's coming across. With the images you're using, the clickbait titles, basics of responding, when they're not even, like, responding or entertaining, what it is you're doing. It's just a very unfortunate, and like you said at the beginning of this conversation, from it's very sad to see that this is the state of affairs that we're in. But we'll leave it in. And I guess just on that, just with the topic of Parchaar, unless there's anything else you guys want to touch upon with this, if we circle back to...
I just want to say one thing, right? Like, Sant Janel Singh genuinely cared about his people, genuinely cared, like, moved, like, wanted to destroy an entire power structure, and saw problems that the Aam Sikh that he cared about didn't see, and lived in such a profound way that his sacrifice moves across time, and it creates and teaches us through powerful Sikh technology of shahadat of how to live in this world. Imagine if Sant Janel Singh claimed to care about his people, and he spoke to them in a way that insulted their pyar for Gursikhi, their reni, their case. It would not make sense. Sant Janel Singh would not be respected and would not be who he is if he engaged in the world in this way. So like, I guess what I'm trying to say is, if you genuinely are intelligent, if you genuinely care about Sikhi, look at the reality that's in front of you. Don't be, you shouldn't be taught about Sikhi in a way that is harmful to you. Violence isn't teaching. You know, when we say ਬੱਚਿਆਂ ਨੂੰ ਸਮਝਾਉਂਦੇ ਆ, like, you know, some parents might think, oh, you know, giving ਬੱਚੇ ਛਿੱਤਰ is a way to teach them to how to improve their behavior. But it's not, man. Sikhi does not teach us that violence teaches in that way. Like, the way of communicating Sikhi is through prem, is through your rani, is through how you exist in this world. And that has to be experienced and has to be felt. And that's why you see Sikhs literally move heaven and earth. And, you know, you that, you know, the Sakhi that you spoke about by Anok Singh, you see that reoccurring. We're gonna Dilli di eternal karka dunge Guru Sahib hukum karo ek wari, right? Like, you know, we'll completely change power structure. All we need is Guru Sahib. We need your agya. We need, you know, your bakshish. And there's a longing there. There's a sense of birag there. There's a, you know, pyar there. And it's not that people aren't concerned about Sikhi, that, you know, that they don't want to see improvements, 100%. But this idea that you've discovered something new, like the neo Khalsa, the new Khalsa, like it is born out of ego, and it's born out of a different worldview, and it's not a Sikh worldview. And that I have a problem with more than, like, you know, the language and the swearing and all of the vulgarity and all that. I have a problem with the values of the standpoint that's being taken. You know, like, you know, I was saying, like, just because, you know, somebody thinks, you know, miracle do bamaya, I've got 2 legs, I've got a brain and a tongue, I can do what Sanjanel Singh did because I've got the same body. Like, there's a world of difference, because Sanjanel Singh di kamai, unada abhyas is what gave them the power. When we teach bacche about Sakhiyan, when we teach them what drove the Sikhs to engage in these confrontations, was the kamai that they had. That's what powered them, right? Like, that's where their strength and their energy came from, not from, you know, like the Duni Chand or the Dalla Sakhi, like their physical prowess, or, you know, their diet, you know, whatever it was from something that was much deeper, that was infused within them through a nirta they had with Sikhi. So Sikhi is something that has to be experienced, and Sangat is not separate from it. You know, if you're spending more time online and less time in Guru's Darbar, then there is a fundamental disconnect there. The Sangat is such an important part of Sikhi, and collectively as Sangat, we're going to move forward. Sangat literally means to move forward together. It's not a congregation, you know, it is moving forward. It's the collective body of the Khalsa, because main meri is kuch nahi, right? Like, that's the whole purpose. Whole fundamental teachings of Gurbani is, you know, ke homme nu marna hai. Like, homme is a rogue, is an illness that inflicts you, and you need to destroy homme in order to experience divine law. I mean, experience Guru Sahib's hukum, right? Like, homme nu maran di bahut zarurat hai. And like, it's not going to happen in this type of dynamic. What it does, it reinforces ego, and it makes ego the medium through which you understand the world. And you're getting E-ism here and E's worldview. But yeah, man.
Yeah. You know, just for me, just to end it, just on that point, and just to bring it back to the topic of Parchaar, and, you know, you mentioned there's Sangat, right? And this is evident in something he said, but also somebody else said something similar, or did something similar a year or 2 ago, I think it was, where something is being said in a camp setting, right? And that gets taken out. And that one little bit of information then gets blown up into everything. And that whole entire event, that entire individuals like Jeevani, that entire organization, whatever they stand for, is then supposedly, like, you know, undermined. But this is the power of Sangat, right? Like Parchaar, this is why you can't take Parchaar in bits. Like, you can certainly learn aspects of different aspects of Sikhi from reading a particular book or reading a particular Jeevani, maybe watching a certain individual speak on YouTube, maybe a lecture. But ultimately, like, the Sikh way of Parchaar, of, you know, propagating Sikhi, has those key components, and Sangat is like a massive part within that, because within Sangat there's no pretense, right? There's you know, you're accountable in that moment, in that space. So it's a proven way to do our Parchaar. It's what we've mobilized upon for decades, if not centuries. And for me, like, Parchaar today, we just have to be mindful of that when Parchaar is co-opted by modernity, and it becomes like this thing to do because it's easy or comfortable or palatable, and it raises awareness. And that isn't, but I don't think as Sikhs we should be interested in that. If if also within that you're distorting like Sikhi. Like, Prachar should be wholesome. It should be reflective of like all of what Sikhi offers, both in Miri and Piri. And Prachar also, for me, what I will say, like maybe we've mentioned this in previous episodes, is that Prachar today needs to also center those who gave their everything for Sikhi in the last 30, 40 years. If you're not centering Sangharsh and Khalistan in your Prachar, then you're not doing Prachar of Sikhi. You're doing Prachar of like whatever you feel comfortable with. And that might even be like the most lofty ideals of Sikhi, but if you're disconnecting that, that's not the Sikhi of Guru Nanak Dev Ji. Guru Nanak Dev Ji was speaking to Babur, they were calling them out, they were calling out the Sids, all different aspects, political, social, religious. It wasn't just one aspect. So as a responsibility, if you're talking about Sikhi, then you need to be genuine enough and offer Sikhi in its entirety, not just nitpicking certain things.
I think sorry, just to add to Rana's point there, if you're doing Prachar of Sikhi and you're not mentioning the recent shaheeds, then what greater example of Sikhi could you be giving instead of that? There's no greater Abhyasi, there's no greater Surma, example that you could give than of the recent times than those shaheeds, isn't it?
Yeah, just on the camp, right? Like Singh's camp, you're talking about where the clip was taken out of context. I've been to Singh's camp once. I was meant to go this year, but really unfortunately, because commitments, I couldn't make it. I feel really bad about it because when I went to Singh's camp that one time I went, what stood out for me the most was the amount of pyar that those Sikhs had for Guru Sahib. Like the amount of effort they put into the darbar and into the routine, and this is a space for young Sikhs to learn about Sikhi in the most positive, correct way that they're going to learn about Sikhi, not through this online discourse. And they created a space with so much care for young Sikh men to be vulnerable, to share, to speak about their experiences of growing up in this fractured existence, of experiencing what it means to be a Sikh in this world, and all of the messiness that comes with, navigating all of this, like bullying, like, substance abuse, all sorts of stuff. So they've put so much effort and so much care into creating this space. And they're doing that not for one of financial resources or incentives. They're doing that because of the legitimacy that they've built through doing their seva. They're doing that because they wanted to create a space for that purpose. And to then take out one thing that's said in a space, or for the person who was in that space who made that recording to share that recording on, not respecting that space, not respecting that there's what is the dynamics that are being held there. If you had a problem with what's being said, speak about it in that space. You go to one of the sevadars and speak. They're all such lovely individuals, and they're open to any feedback, any criticism. They're going to take it in the way that most Gursikhs take feedback and criticism if they value Sikhi in that way. ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਪਿਆਰ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਤੁਹਾਡੇ ਵਿਚਾਰ ਸੁਣਨੇ ਆ, and they're going to reflect on it, and if any improvement or sudar needs to be made, it will be made. And like, I just, it's just, I think that expose culture, that sensationalism culture, the monetization culture that goes hand in hand with this online thing is just like, it's a machine that keeps like fueling itself, that needs constant new controversy and, wants to create this sense of emergency and urgency, which doesn't... Content, right? Like even the translation issues aside with the Nanak Nam Japji Sahib translation, I saw it when I saw it on YouTube. I didn't recognize it as a translation. I recognized it as content first. Like I saw this is being created as content, because it's monetized, it's put on YouTube, like ads, etc., for the views, but that's a larger, conversation. I think we should have a conversation about technology, because I think it's fascinating because, Sikh technology and, various aspects come into it around architecture, around like what is technology and what is the purpose of technology. And, the systems that we're using now and, making them ubiquitous and making them universal for technology when it comes from one point of view, like the dot on the graph that claims to be the graph, right? Like if Sikhs were to create technology, technology. What does that technology look like? When Sikhs have created technology, it's led to the creation of Sikh Raj. So when when they've encountered technology that's not their own, they've taken that technology, they've cannibalized it, they've deconstructed it, and they've recreated it in a way to serve their purposes. But yeah, like I just think it's there should be a care given to the efforts that Gursikhs are making in order to do Sikhi Parchaar. And, you don't have to agree with everything. You don't have to agree with, like it was, we're talking about Jagraj Singh. We had differences of opinion with Jagraj Singh, primarily around Khalistan and Sikh Sangarsh and how important it was and how we understand it and whatever. And these are ongoing conversations and discussions that need to take place within the Panth. And it's not a problem that's limited to one individual or one organization. It is a phenomena. It happens, every Parcharak and Katha Vajak that comes from Punjab to the UK, they know there's a parameter and they're going to stay within that parameter. Otherwise, they're going to face the violence of the state, and they're going to face travel restrictions and all sorts of, layers of technology that are going to be implemented against them in order to enforce a power dynamic. So, yeah,
just to summarize for me very quickly, last point is, earlier we were speaking about translation, and maybe we should do a separate episode on like modernity, just to go into in a bit more depth. Let me bring in some of the academic theories that exist, like Magnolo and those others. But for me, like translation, and even like, I guess, like this rise of this like social media influencer type person entity that exists, all of that is tied to modernity. Like that exists because of that. And I think that's something maybe we should try and tackle in the next episode. It's not an isolated, like, random event. This is all because of the mahal that we're living in. That's
I think that's
yeah. Well,
no, you can.
I want to say that it's just a reflection of the society we're living in, and it's the upside down thing, isn't it? It's like instead of bringing out Sikhi how it ought to be done, unapologetically, it's the opposite way, because we know there are certain parameters we've got to work with. And
I was going to say that I think that's super important, and really interesting for me just to hear you guys talk about it in a future episode, because I think I think it's like that this modernity issue is like, it's like a massive leak, and we're trying to mop up all of the symptoms of it. And I think because essentially, if you look at we talked about Nanak Nam, we talked about this e-guy, it all comes from that same place where you think that whether you want to accept it or not, that inherently you believe that because it was a while ago that Sikhi was founded, that it could be better now. Like that there's ways or techniques or technologies or languages or whatever it might be, like the neo Khalsa, the new Khalsa, because for some reason koi kami si ki Khalsa ch in. So I think if instead of like keep tackling those different issues as when they appear, that the root of this all is this inherent understanding or belief that it's somewhat backdated, it somewhat needs updating or for whatever. And I think if we can solve that freaking gira in like our minds in the West, I think, because you don't have that in Punjab. Like a lot of the Parchariks, I mean, they literally, in the Taksal, they pride themselves on doing things exactly the way they did things. They don't have this thing that let's bring tablets into the Taksal. I mean, they could have tablets, right, Shira? They could have tablets on the thing that they hold, the Gutka Sahibs. They could do all these different things, but they hold those things sacred for a certain reason. It's not out of ritual, it's not out of dogma, it's because they've seen the results, right? These are time tested.
That's the most better technology. Speaking that,
it's better technology. It's better technology.
Yeah, just a penny for the thoughts of those like Surma who are still resisting in Indian jails today. What, like, if you heard the word neo Khalsa, like just think about it. Like, that doesn't make any sense. Like, and again, that term exists to make your life more comfortable because you're living a certain way. Whereas the actual Khalsa still stands today. Like, they're not going anywhere. It's still resisting. How many jails does anybody know the numbers? Like, that in itself is an entire episode as well. So the Khalsa's not going anywhere. It's not going anywhere. It's just we just can't impose our kamzoriya onto the Panth.
And you got to think about where the person is standing when they're saying neo Khalsa. Like standpoint is such an important concept to understand, because none of this stuff is neutral, right? In order for you to say new Khalsa, you're standing above Guru and above the Khalsa. Because you're being in a position, Guru Sahib ne Khalsa sirjya, and tusi nami cheez kar rahe hain. You're making something new, you're improving it, you're doing something. So you're building on top of Guru Sahib, and you're building on top of what the Khalsa is. So you're taking a position. So that in itself is massive. And one thing I wanted to say earlier about like the whole translation thing and is the disconnect from other struggles. Like when we're in this phenomena with translation and all the rest of it, and because we as a collective think that this only happened to us. And when I say we as a collective, I'm particularly talking about the diaspora, particularly the UK diaspora. And so whenever I talk in general terms, I'm actually talking about, Sikhs in the UK. But because we're so disconnected from other struggles, and because we don't value the other struggles, particularly of Black people, particularly of Muslims, because we view them the same way Gore view them, because the Gora is our teacher in that dynamic. If you ask your Punjabi, what do you think of a Black person? They'll be like, oh, Choria, you should be scared of them, etc., which is what white people think of Black people. We've learned that racism from them. So because of that disconnect, because we're learning about other struggles from whiteness, when we fail for the, like you said, we fail for the connection to be made, the penny to drop, that this just hasn't just happened to us. The phenomena of translating your knowledge and disseminating your knowledge in a language that is not your own is also a struggle that other people experience. Ngugi writes about this extensively and takes a point, in the whole Pan-African movement, in Pan-African literature, there's like a split and a fallout that occurs where some of them, like Ngugi, say you cannot convey our worldview in English. We have to start writing. And he's someone who begins writing in English, then refuses to write in English and goes back to writing in Gikuyu, like his native language. And, it's a profound shift that occurs. And so that struggle isn't just, decolonizing the mind, like a fantastic book. And, it's such an important book. We should do like a episode on this book and like, the episodes and the analogies and the stories that the Sakya that he shares of, how, colonization and language and the violence of that was enforced in the villages and, in their people by the Angrej. It's the same thing that's happened to us. The same thing that's happened in this country with Wales and Scotland, like the denigration of their language. And, here, we were thinking about sending our kid to a Gaelic school. And the teachers there were talking about how, children growing up in the Highlands, like they don't have the language in their homes anymore. Like it's disappearing. And, they're so concerned about reviving their language because, a worldview comes with it. So when we're disconnected from other struggles, we don't understand that what's happening to us has also happened to other people. Like the whole, Sikh capitalism stuff, Black people have gone through that with Black capitalism and Black excellence and thinking that liberation is going to come through acquiring material wealth and building a Black elite and, by us siloing ourselves and not being actual students of the world. And people like these online influencers, they claim to be students of the world, but they're not students of the world because they're not looking at the struggles that are occurring in the world where power is being contested.
A specific world, isn't it? They're looking at.
They're looking at a subordinated world. And that's fine. If you want to be like the junior partner, if you want to live in that subordinated world and you want to live in a world where you think the Gora's way of doing things is the best, that's absolutely fine. It's not a world I'm interested in. It's not a world I think Sikh should be interested in. I think Sikhi teaches us to look at the contestation of power. Guru Sahib doesn't want us to be subordinate. Guru Sahib has never wanted the Khalsa to be subordinate to any other entity or any other power. Guru Sahib has given us Padshahi, like in Pant Prakash, where, in Navashwas Siga, where, the Sakhi is being relayed, or Jathedar Darbara saying, where they say, the world can shift of its axis, the North Star could change and disappear, but Guru's hukum, can never go bare artha, it can never go without being defined. And Guru Sahib has bestowed Padshahi upon us. So I don't think we should be subordinate. I think Sikhi offers a worldview that empowers us in insanely crazy ways. It offers us so much. And it teaches us to directly look at power relations and power dynamics, because that's where like if you know the whole Parchaar thing, right? Like why do we keep circling back to Khalistan? Is about wholeness. It's about also power. If your Parchaar isn't teaching you to confront power, then it's not allowing you to flourish and be whole. Like healing and flourishing are two different things. If your Parchaar isn't giving you space to heal or to flourish, it's not allowing you to develop into the Gursikhs that we idolize. That's why, we go to the 18th century as cultural content rather than the Sangharsh's cultural content. Because if we went to the recent Sangharshas like the Khalistan Sangharsh, that would demand more of us. That would demand a confrontation that Sikhs perhaps are not interested, or maybe they've falsely convinced themselves that we're not capable of having anymore, which I think is is a topic for another day. But
yeah, just on the translation thing as well, just very quickly, is somebody might be watching is thinking, well, you guys are speaking about the limits of translation and limits of the English language, yet this entire conversation is pretty much taking place in English, and that's a fair point. But the problem is, even within that, you will no doubt see that there is, what we're talking about isn't necessarily the language. It's what you mentioned, Shamsher Singh, about that worldview, right? Ke duniya nu dekhan da nazariya. And that Sikhi and Gurmat is an entire worldview. It's not and part of the problem of the Parchaar today, which I want to kind of go on to and talk about, which we haven't got time for now, was this idea of like Sikhi as the religion. And like a lot of Parchaar is creating awareness about, we're the 5th largest religion in the world. And within that, then people's first questions will be, well, what do you believe? Who do you worship? What do you wear? What? And the whole thing is that is a different conversation. That dynamic is not then Gurmat as a worldview, as a means to change your entire existence from being a Manmukh to becoming a Gurmukh. And so this is where like a lot of the interactions are on that same model, that Christian missionary model of like converts or raising awareness to tell them how great we are. But if we were to put out of Sikhi, as I said a few times already in this podcast, it has to be encompassing of both Miri and Piri. It can't be one or the other.
But on that note, I'm going to have to wrap it up.
Yeah, I think we should wrap it up there. I think the next episode, leave this bit in as well, so people who are watching can see that, we're not like, this isn't like a polished script, and some of the things that we're talking about are real. And, even whilst we were speaking, it was a bit jarring for me at one point when we were speaking about a certain individual and talking about this Mahan Shaheeds, but it's important to address these issues, right? So, okay, we'll leave it there, Singo.
Okay, why?
ਕਿਸੇ ਵਜ਼ੀਰ ਦੀ ਕਿਸੇ ਰਾਜੇ ਦੀ ਪਰਵਾਹ ਨਹੀਂ ਕਰਨੀ, ਭਾਵੇਂ ਕਿੱਡਾ ਵੀ ਵੱਡੇ ਤੋਂ ਵੱਡਾ ਹੋਵੇ, ਗੁਰਮਤ ਦਾ ਤਿਆਗ ਕਦੇ ਨਹੀਂ ਕਰੂੰਗਾ।